Tonight we descend into one of the oldest surviving stories humanity ever pressed into clay, following a goddess who approaches 7 locked gates beneath the world. The surviving Sumerian composition is known today as the Descent of Inanna to the Netherworld, reconstructed from multiple ancient manuscript witnesses rather than one perfectly preserved secret tablet. Scholars working with the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at the University of Oxford have translated the sequence in which 7 gates are opened individually and 7 objects are removed from Inanna. That sequence is real. The claim that these objects represent 7 memories erased before reincarnation is something far less certain, and that uncertainty is where our journey becomes interesting. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while the room grows quieter around you, tell us where you are listening from and what time it is there. Perhaps it is late evening beside a glowing city window, early morning beneath rain, or midnight somewhere where every sensible person has already gone to bed. Wherever you are, settle comfortably, because the clay fragments we are approaching have survived kingdoms, abandoned temples, collapsed walls, forgotten Gagran languages, and several thousand years of people confidently misunderstanding one another. Picture southern Mesopotamia beneath a pale and enormous sky. Sunlight presses against mud brick walls, while dust gathers inside narrow streets and irrigation channels carry brown water toward fields of barley. Reeds tremble beside marshes beyond the settlement. Somewhere nearby, animals complain in the heat, merchants argue over measures of grain, and a temple courtyard smells faintly of smoke, oil, wool, and damp clay. You are standing within a civilization that writes contracts, hymns, administrative lists, royal praises, prayers, myths, and complaints onto small surfaces made from ordinary earth. Writing here is physical work. A scribe presses a reed stylus into wet clay, creating wedge-shaped impressions that later generations will call cuneiform. Each mark seems modest, yet together these impressions preserve voices that would otherwise have vanished completely. Sumerian literature survived because scribes copied compositions repeatedly, especially within scholarly traditions of the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia before the Common Era. The Metropolitan Museum of Art notes that literary traditions concerning Inanna remained alive among Mesopotamian scribes across long periods, demonstrating how carefully such stories could be transmitted. Inanna herself is not a minor figure hiding within an obscure corner of ancient religion. She belongs among the most important deities of Mesopotamia, associated with sexuality, warfare, political power, and the planet Venus. Her identity contains contradictions that ancient worshippers appear perfectly comfortable holding together. She can inspire affection and terror, fertility and destruction, tenderness and conquest. Modern categories like neat little boxes, ancient gods rarely cooperate. Researchers connected with the University of Pennsylvania describe her as prominent in both sexual love and warfare, while her celestial identity was associated with Venus. This makes her descent especially strange. A powerful goddess voluntarily turns toward the realm beneath the living world, ruled by her sister Erasure. The poem presents the underworld as a regulated domain rather than vague darkness. There are officials, there are instructions, there are gates. Most importantly for our mystery, there are rules that even Inanna cannot simply ignore. You can almost feel the temperature changing as imagination carries you downward. Warm dust gives way to cool stone. Bright courtyards disappear. Familiar smells fade beneath something mineral and still. The sound of sandals becomes clearer because there is less ordinary life around you. Somewhere ahead stands a gatekeeper named Neti, responsible for controlling passage into the domain of Erasure. The surviving text describes Inanna arriving alone and demanding admission. Neti reports her presence to his queen, and Ereshkigal gives an unusually precise command. The 7 gates must be secured, then each must be opened separately. That detail matters. Ancient stories often repeat actions because repetition gives ritual structure to narrative. Here, however, repetition also creates a sequence you can count. 1 gate, then another, until 7 thresholds have been crossed. At every entrance, something belonging to Inanna is removed. The Oxford translation preserves the recurring explanation that the laws or powers of the underworld are being fulfilled, and that Inanna must not challenge them. This is where modern retellings often become much more confident than the clay allows. You may encounter claims that each gate removes a precise layer of memory, consciousness, personality, or spiritual identity before a soul is prepared for rebirth. It is an elegant system, perhaps almost too elegant. The Sumerian text itself describes possessions and garments being removed, but it does not plainly announce 7 categories of memory being erased. That distinction does not make the story less mysterious, it makes it more mysterious. Why should a goddess lose her symbols of power in a fixed order? Why 7 gates instead of 3, 9, or 12? Why must she accept every removal without protest? Ancient listeners may have understood associations that are now difficult for us to reconstruct. Ritual specialists may have heard theological meanings hidden inside objects whose significance seems obscure today. Literary audiences may simply have recognized the brutal logic of entering a realm where earthly status means increasingly little. A particularly curious detail makes certainty even harder. One manuscript witness appears to position the measuring rod and line differently within the sequence, reminding scholars that ancient compositions could survive through copies containing variations. The tablets are therefore not magical recordings untouched by human hands. They belong to scribal history, with all the copying, interpretation, preservation, damage, and occasional inconsistency that implies. This creates an open, scholarly question surrounding how literally each removed object should be interpreted. Some elements plainly represent status or divine authority, while others may carry ritual meanings that remain debate. The Metropolitan Museum describes Mesopotamian gods as possessing a divine radiance or splendor connected with their supernatural presence, and notes that descent into the netherworld could involve losing such power. What appears to us as undressing may therefore have conveyed something far deeper to an ancient audience. And then comes the fringe possibility, whispered mostly outside mainstream Assyriology. Perhaps the 7 removals describe an inward process, with external objects serving as metaphors for layers of identity. It is conceivable as interpretation, it is not established translation. Those 2 sentences must remain beside each other throughout the mystery, because the difference between them is the difference between discovering an ancient belief and creating a modern one. For now, you remain outside those 7 gates. Nothing has yet been taken from you. Behind them lies a carefully ordered dismantling of divine privilege, one object at a time, until even the Queen of Heaven possesses almost nothing that once announced who she was. The clay does not say that she forgets, yet something is being stripped away. And in the silence between those 2 possibilities, the oldest part of our mystery begins. Your mind drifts across southern Mesopotamia toward the workshops where clay tablets once dried beneath warm air, and the story of Inanna begins to look less like a single ancient book and more like a scattered memory. No complete original manuscript survives from the moment when the poem was first composed. Instead, scholars reconstruct the descent from separate copies written by different scribes in different places, sometimes generations apart. That fact changes how you imagine the text. You are not opening one perfect tablet preserved untouched since deep antiquity. You are listening to a chorus of clay fragments, each one carrying part of the same old story through age, copying, correction, and time. The surviving manuscripts belong mainly to scribal traditions flourishing during the early second millennium before the Common Era, although the composition itself may preserve older religious material. Archaeologists uncovered many literary tablets in cities such as Nippur and Ur, where scribes trained by copying established works. Excavations connected with the University of Pennsylvania helped reveal how central Nippur was to Mesopotamian scholarship. Especially through to temple and school contexts, these finds show that ancient literature survived because generations of students repeatedly copied difficult compositions by hand. A modern reader imagines preservation through libraries. A Sumerian scribe preserved culture through repetition, sore fingers, and probably more correction than anyone likes admitting. You can almost feel the tablet resting against your palm. The clay is cool before drying and slightly resistant beneath the stylus. Each wedge-shaped impression must be placed carefully because there is no comfortable delete key waiting nearby. A damaged sign can confuse meaning centuries later. A missing edge can swallow an entire phrase. When excavators eventually recover these pieces, they are often cracked, incomplete, or separated from companion fragments by accident of burial. This means every reconstructed line involves comparison between manuscripts, grammatical knowledge, and cautious judgment. Records confirm that scribal education in Mesopotamia relied heavily on copying lexical lists, proverbs, hymns, myths, and model compositions. Students learned not only how to write signs, but also how to enter a cultural world encoded through inherited texts. In that sense, the story of Inanna was never merely entertainment. It belonged to a learned environment where religious tradition, literary skill, and social prestige overlapped. A scribe copying the descent was practicing language while also handling a narrative filled with divine authority, ritual structure, and the dangerous geography of the dead. One curious detail is that many ancient tablets were not created as luxury objects. Clay was cheap, abundant, and practical. A student could write on a small tablet, smooth it, reuse it, or discard it. Some surviving literary pieces may owe their existence to ordinary accidents rather than deliberate preservation. A tablet falls, a room collapses, a fire hardens clay that might otherwise have dissolved. Human civilization sometimes survives because catastrophe accidentally becomes an archivist. This makes the descent especially fascinating because different copies do not always preserve identical wording. Scribal variation can appear in spelling, line order, omitted phrases, or the placement of details. Scholars therefore speak carefully when reconstructing the poem. There remains debate over how much variation reflects copying error and how much reflects legitimate local or performative traditions. Researchers at institutions such as Yale University and the University of Oxford have emphasized that Mesopotamian literature often existed through manuscript traditions rather than one fixed authoritative edition. For a moment, it feels as though you are watching the story assemble itself on a long table covered with fragments. One piece preserves a gate, another preserves a divine object, another contains a command from Erasure. Some edges are smooth, others are broken into irregular shadows where words once stood. The silence around each gap becomes part of the reading experience. What is missing cannot simply be invented, although modern imagination is always eager to volunteer. This is important because claims about 7 stages of erased memory often depend upon treating the surviving poem as though it were a precise instructional document. It is not written like a manual explaining the rebirth of every human soul. It is a mythological narrative centered on a goddess descending into a divine realm. The sevenfold structure exists clearly, but its meaning must be interpreted through literary and religious context. That leaves room for symbolism, but it also places limits on certainty. The opening movement of the poem presents Inanna making deliberate preparations before entering danger. She does not wander into the underworld by mistake. She leaves instructions with her minister Ninshubur, telling this loyal attendant what to do if she fails to return. This reveals that Inanna understands the descent may be fatal. Her journey is therefore calculated, political, and strangely controlled. She knows enough about the place below to arrange help in advance. You hear a distant scrape of sandals against packed earth as Ninshubur receives these instructions. Ancient storytelling often uses repeated commands so listeners can remember sequences and anticipate consequences. Inanna explains that mourning must be performed and divine assistance sought if she does not emerge. This repetition creates tension without requiring haste. The danger is known, the route is chosen. The goddess moves toward it anyway. A fringe interpretation sometimes treats Ninshubur as representing the surviving higher mind, the part of consciousness that remains outside while another part descends through layers of forgetting. This reading can be evocative, especially for modern listeners interested in psychology or spiritual symbolism. Yet the ancient text itself presents Ninshubur as a divine attendant fulfilling a practical role within the narrative. The psychological meaning remains speculative, not something securely demonstrated by the surviving language. The scholarly debate becomes subtler when you ask why Inanna descends at all. Some interpretations emphasize her desire to extend power into the realm ruled by Erasure. Others stress ritual symbolism connected with death, transformation, divine rivalry, or seasonal patterns. The poem itself provides motives that can appear layered rather than simple. Ancient audiences may have understood political and theological implications that modern readers can only partly recover. You notice how easily certainty begins to dissolve. A tablet gives you words, but not always tone. A repeated line gives you structure, but not necessarily explanation. A broken passage invites reconstruction, but also restraint. Archaeology recovers objects, philology recovers language. Neither can completely recover the thoughts of everyone who once heard the story recited beside a temple wall. There is something almost fitting about this uncertainty. The poem concerns entry into a place where ordinary identities become unstable, while the poem itself reaches you through damaged objects whose original context has partly vanished. You are dealing with memory in two different senses. The myth preserves cultural memory, yet the physical record is incomplete. What survives is astonishing. What is lost may be larger still. Imagine a scribe finishing a copy late in the day. Sunlight narrows across the room while reed smoke and dust linger in the air. The final signs are pressed carefully into clay. Perhaps the tablet is placed on a shelf. Perhaps it becomes a teaching exercise. Perhaps nobody in that room imagined strangers thousands of years later examining every surviving mark and arguing about whether the goddess is surrendering royal power, ritual protection, cosmic authority, or layers of consciousness. The oddest part is not that later generations reinterpret the story. Humans have always done that. The oddest part is how easily a fragmented ancient poem can acquire the reputation of being a secret document containing a perfectly ordered doctrine. The real history is less tidy and more compelling. It consists of scribes, broken tablets, variant readings, vanished contexts, and persistent symbols that refuse to explain themselves completely. The descent begins within that uncertainty. 7 gates wait below, but the road toward them has already revealed something important. Ancient memory does not survive as a flawless voice from the past. It survives as fragments gathered carefully enough that a voice can be heard again. The number 7 begins to appear across Mesopotamian thought with the quiet persistence of something deeply familiar. You encounter it in divine groupings, ritual patterns, celestial observations, incantations, and literary structures. To an ancient listener, 7 would not have sounded random. It carried the weight of repetition, completeness, danger, and sacred arrangement. Modern researchers working in Assyriology have long noted how frequently the number appears across Sumerian and Akkadian religious traditions. The pattern is real, although its precise meaning changes from text to text. 7 could organize a story without functioning as a secret code, and this distinction becomes essential when searching for hidden systems inside old myths. Your imagination settles over a temple courtyard at dusk, where shadows lengthen against mud brick walls, oil lamps are beginning to glow, and somewhere a priest recites a formula learned through generations. Ancient Mesopotamian religion does not divide neatly into the categories modern minds prefer. Astronomy, ritual, kingship, healing, omen reading, and divine mythology often overlap. Numbers can therefore operate simultaneously as practical counts and symbolic structures. 7 may mark a completed series in one text, a dangerous group in another, or a ritual requirement somewhere else. The same number can carry several meanings without belonging to one universal doctrine. One mainstream historical fact offers a useful anchor. Mesopotamian scholars observed the visible heavens with remarkable patience, recording movements of the sun, moon, planets, and prominent stars over long periods, the 7 celestial bodies visible to the unaided eye, including the sun, moon, and 5 visible planets, later became important within many ancient astronomical and astrological traditions. Scholars at institutions such as the University of Chicago and Yale University have demonstrated how closely Mesopotamian celestial observation became linked with divination and royal decision-making. Yet the presence of 7 planets does not automatically explain every sacred 7 appearing in Sumerian literature. Similar numbers may gather different meanings through different traditions. You can hear the temptation already: 7 planets, 7 gates, 7 judges, 7 objects removed. Surely this must reveal one hidden mechanism. Perhaps it does. Perhaps it reveals only that 7 was culturally powerful enough to be reused again and again. Ancient religions often work through familiar patterns. A storyteller chooses a number the audiences immediately recognize as meaningful, just as later cultures repeatedly use 3, 12, or 40. Symbolism does not require a single secret explanation. The 7-fold pattern appears prominently in groups of supernatural beings. Mesopotamian literature sometimes speaks of 7 sages, 7 destructive demons, 7 divine judges, or groups whose identities shift across time and genre. These beings are not interchangeable. Their shared number may signal completeness or cosmic force rather than membership in one consistent pantheon. A council of 7 can sound final. 7 enemies can feel overwhelming. 7 ritual actions can suggest that nothing has been left unfinished. A quirky detail emerges from magical and medical texts, where illness could be imagined as the work of hostile supernatural forces arriving in numbered groups. Some incantations describe 7 evil beings with almost theatrical enthusiasm, as though one demon would have been insufficiently inconvenient. These figures can move through doors, walls, streets, and bodies, producing disorder that ritual specialists attempt to reverse. The number adds rhythm to the recitation. It also makes the threat feel organized, which is somehow more unsettling than chaos. Your ears catch the low cadence of repeated words. A ritual specialist may speak a formula several times while manipulating water, flour, wool in figurines or plants. Repetition gives ritual a structure that participants can follow. 7 repetitions can make an action feel sealed. Yet surviving texts rarely stop to explain why the number carries authority. Ancient practitioners did not write explanatory notes for people living thousands of years later. They simply used a pattern their own culture already understood. The scholarly debate becomes especially interesting here. Some researchers argue that 7 acquired importance partly through astronomical observation, while others emphasize older religious, mathematical, or literary traditions, there is no single explanation accepted for every appearance of the number. Oxford University scholarship on Mesopotamian religion has repeatedly shown how dangerous it is to reduce broad symbolic traditions to one origin. Cultural meanings accumulate. A number can become sacred because generations keep treating it as sacred, even when the first reason disappears. Mathematics also adds another layer. Mesopotamian scribes famously used a base 60 numerical system for many calculations, leaving an inheritance still visible whenever you divide hours into 60 minutes or circles into 360 degrees. 7 sits awkwardly inside 60 because it does not divide the number evenly. That mathematical inconvenience has occasionally inspired speculative theories that 7 represented something incomplete, resistant, or mysterious. It is an appealing idea, but evidence connecting this arithmetic property directly to the 7 gates remains weak. Sometimes an interesting coincidence remains exactly that. For a moment, the smell of baked clay and lamp oil seems almost tangible. A scribe traces numerical signs beside a column of words while a teacher watches. Numbers are not abstract decorations here. They measure grain, land, labour, silver, time, and celestial cycles. The same scribal culture capable of precise accounting also writes myths populated by gods and monsters. There is no contradiction to Mesopotamian thinkers. Ordered calculation and divine order could exist within the same intellectual world. This helps explain why 7 gates would feel deliberate. A descent through one gate is travel. A descent through 7 gates becomes a process. Each threshold increases distance from ordinary space and strengthens the impression that the traveller is entering a realm governed by its own laws. Repetition slows movement. The listener begins anticipating the next removal before it happens. Ritual structure turns geography into transformation. Fringe interpretations often go further, suggesting that 7 gates correspond to 7 levels of consciousness, 7 energy centers, 7 planetary spheres, or 7 layers of memory. These systems can produce elegant diagrams, especially when assembled from traditions separated by centuries and continents. Elegance, however, is not evidence. There is no surviving Sumerian passage that plainly maps the 7 gates onto 7 psychological memory stages. Such comparisons may be useful as modern symbolic readings, but they should not be mistaken for ancient doctrine. The stronger possibility is subtler. 7 may function as a language of completeness. By passing 7 thresholds, Inanna does not merely walk deeper underground, she experiences a totalized ascent, one structured strongly enough that the audience understands nothing important can remain untouched. The sequence gives finality to each removal. It suggests order inside a realm that might otherwise appear chaotic. Perhaps this is why the number still attracts modern imagination. 7 feels small enough to remember and large enough to become a journey. It promises sequence. It invites classification. Once 7 steps appear, the mind naturally wants 7 meanings to match them. Ancient storytellers may have understood this instinct long before modern psychology gave it technical vocabulary. The uncertainty remains useful. 7 is unquestionably important within Mesopotamian culture. Its repeated appearance cannot be dismissed as accidental, yet its significance cannot be forced into one universal formula. The number behaves more like a doorway than an answer. It leads toward astronomy, ritual, mythology, mathematics, and literary design, while refusing to belong completely to any one of them. And somewhere beneath all those possibilities, 7 doors remain closed, waiting for a goddess whose power will soon be measured not by what she carries, but by what she's compelled to surrender. A gatekeeper stands where the ordered world of the living begins to lose its authority. His name is Neti, and his role is neither decorative nor mysterious. He controls access to the realm ruled by Erasure, the great queen of the underworld, in the surviving narrative. Inanna approaches him with confidence, but confidence is not permission. Nettie questions her arrival, receives instructions from his queen, and prepares the passage according to strict procedure. The scene feels almost bureaucratic, which may be one reason it is so unsettling. Even divine power must submit to rules here. You hear the faint scrape of a bolt drawn across a heavy door. The sound is simple, almost domestic, yet the meaning is severe. Nettie is ordered to close the 7 gates and then open them one at a time. This detail creates the mechanism at the centre of the descent. The gates do not stand open in a ceremonial corridor. They must be controlled individually, each threshold creating a separate act of entry. The movement is measured, deliberate, and impossible to rush. A goddess cannot simply stride through all 7 in a burst of royal confidence. The text presents Nettie as an obedient official acting under Erasure authority. He does not invent the rules, and he does not appear to enjoy enforcing them. That distinction matters because the underworld is not portrayed as random cruelty. It is governed by an established order. Mesopotamian religion often imagines divine realms through structures that resemble human institutions, including councils, offices, messengers, guards, and judges. Scholars at the University of Chicago and Yale University have examined how ancient Mesopotamian divine society often mirrors political organization. The gods rule, deliberate, command, and delegate. The dead inhabit a world shaped by law. For a moment, it feels as though the air grows colder around the first doorway. Nettie opens it only after the system has been set in place. Inanna crosses the threshold, and an item is removed from her body. She reacts. The question is natural. Why is this happening? Yet the answer is not personal. She is told that the laws of the underworld must be fulfilled, and that she should not object. The repeated formula is crucial because it tells the listener that each removal belongs to a rule larger than the individual traveller. That phrase gives the gates their authority. Inanna may be powerful above, but below she enters a jurisdiction where her rank does not exempt her from procedure. Ancient audiences would likely have recognised the idea immediately. Kings, officials, priests, merchants, and labourers all lived within systems of obligation. Temples collected goods, palaces issued commands, courts settled disputes, contracts regulated exchanges. The underworld, too, could be imagined as a place where order continued, only under darker conditions. Records from Mesopotamian administrative life confirm how deeply structured bureaucracy shaped daily existence. Clay tablets preserve grain distributions, labour assignments, tax obligations, property transfers, and legal settlements in astonishing detail. A society accustomed to lists and procedures might naturally imagine divine domains in similar terms. The supernatural did not have to be shapeless, it could have gatekeepers. One quirky aspect of Nettie's scene is how little theatrical villainy it contains. A modern retelling might turn him into a sinister guardian with flaming eyes and a dramatic speech. The ancient version is stranger because it is calmer. Nettie reports, receives instructions, and performs his duty. There is something almost painfully ordinary about that. The most dangerous threshold in the universe may still have someone responsible for opening the door correctly. Each gate therefore becomes less like an obstacle and more like a station within a controlled transformation. The first one changes Inanna's condition. The second changes it further. The third continues the pattern. With every passage, the listener understands that entry has a cost, yet the cost is not paid in silver, food, or sacrifice. It is paid through the progressive removal of what Inanna carries and wears. The exact significance of this stripping remains debated among scholars. Some interpret it primarily as the dismantling of royal and divine authority. Others emphasize ritual humiliation, symbolic vulnerability, or the rules governing entry into the land of the dead. There is also discussion about whether the sequence reflects ceremonial practices familiar to ancient audiences. No single explanation resolves every detail. The objects clearly matter, but their meanings may overlap. Your fingertips almost sense the contrast between ornament and gate, metal, stone, woven cloth, and polished surfaces belong to the world of status and visibility. A gate belongs to architecture and control, as each threshold claims something from Inanna. The physical environment seems to overpower the social identity she brings with her. The deeper she goes, the less her appearance can announce who she is. This is where modern interpretations often place the idea of memory erasure. The sequence is so orderly that it invites psychological mapping. One item becomes identity, another becomes perception, another becomes desire, another becomes memory. The result can feel persuasive because the structure is genuinely ancient, while the assigned meanings are often modern. The distinction is subtle enough that retellings can blur it without the listener noting it. A fringe reading proposes that Nettie functions like a custodian of consciousness, preventing the traveller from carrying complete identity between worlds. In that interpretation, each gate removes a layer needed for earthly individuality, preparing the soul for dissolution or rebirth. It is an elegant idea, especially within modern spiritual systems. Yet the original narrative does not describe Nettie erasing recollection, childhood experiences, personal names, or knowledge. He removes objects. Interpretation begins only when symbolic meaning is added. That does not make symbolism illegitimate. Ancient literature depends upon symbolism constantly. Crowns represent authority, clothing can express status, weapons can signal power, jewelry can identify rank, devotion, wealth, or divine connection. The question is not whether the objects mean something. The question is how precisely modern readers can reconstruct what they meant to an audience separated from them by thousands of years. The repetition of the gates may itself be more important than any one object. A single removal could be insult. 7 removals create a process. The listener hears the rhythm forming and begins to anticipate the next surrender. The underworld does not conquer Inanna in one dramatic gesture. It reduces her gradually, with administrative patience. That slow dismantling is more psychologically powerful than sudden defeat because each stage offers time to understand what has been lost. You can imagine Nettie stepping aside after each action. No argument changes the rule. No appeal interrupts the procedure. The doors open because Erasure has allowed entry under specific conditions, and those conditions apply completely. The descent becomes a controlled exchange between movement and loss. To proceed farther, Inanna must accept becoming less visibly herself. There is a quiet philosophical possibility inside this structure. Perhaps the gates reflect an ancient intuition that crossing into death means leaving social identity behind. Titles cannot travel, jewelry cannot command, political status cannot persuade into darkness. Whether the Sumerians intended such a broad message is uncertain, but the symbolism fits the logic of the scene. Every threshold weakens the signs that distinguish one powerful individual from everyone else. The door closes softly in imagination, and another one waits in darkness. Nettie does not explain the entire system. Erasure does not provide a theological lecture. The text lets the structure teach through repetition. One gate opens, something is surrendered. The traveller continues under rules she cannot suspend. That is the exact ancient mechanism preserved within the story. 7 thresholds, 7 acts of removal, one controlled descent governed by the laws of the underworld. What those removals do to identity remains a question. The first loss is a crown, and with it the descent becomes more than physical movement. Inanna wears the shugura, a royal headpiece associated with divine authority and exalted status. Resting above the face, the crown is the most immediate declaration of rank. It announces who stands before you before a single word is spoken. In the underworld, that declaration is removed at the first threshold, and the symbolism is difficult to ignore. The goddess enters wearing the visible grammar of power. She continues without its highest sign. You can imagine the sensation before the meaning arrives. Metal or decorated material is lifted from the head, leaving the scalp exposed to cooler air. The weight disappears suddenly. The body feels lighter, yet the loss does not feel liberating. Ancient ceremonial dress was never merely decorative. Clothing and ornaments could communicate office, divine favour, legal position, wealth, gender, profession, and ritual purpose. A person could be read socially through appearance long before conversation began. Mainstream scholarship treats Inanna's regalia as part of her divine and royal identity rather than random jewellery. Researchers at the University of Oxford and scholars of Mesopotamian religion have emphasised the close relationship between divine symbols and political authority. Kings ruled through visible signs such as crowns, staffs, robes, standards, and ceremonial objects. Gods were represented with their own attributes as well. Removing a crown therefore carries an obvious political meaning. Authority is not destroyed yet, but its outward recognition has been challenged. This first surrender produces an important distinction between power and memory. A crown can be taken without changing what its wearer remembers. Inanna may still know exactly who she is. She may remember her cities, temples, lovers, battles, obligations, and divine relationships. Nothing in the preserved wording clearly states that these recollections vanish. Yet the removal creates a psychological effect because identity is partly maintained through recognition. When no external sign confirms rank, the self must carry its own certainty. Perhaps that is where modern interpretations begin their quiet expansion. If the crown represents social identity, then losing it can be imagined as the first weakening of a remembered self. A speculative reading may call this the erasure of status memory, the layer containing titles, roles, and social definitions. The idea sounds plausible because human beings still experience identity through labels: parent, ruler, worker, stranger, citizen, priest. Remove enough labels, and a difficult question remains: who are you without them? The ancient text does not answer that question directly. It does something more restrained. It shows the object being removed and allows the descent to continue. That veneer creates interpretive space, but silence should not be confused with confirmation. Scholars continue debating how closely each object corresponds to a distinct theological concept. Some see a systematic dismantling of Inanna's powers, while others caution that ancient regalia can carry multiple overlapping meanings that resist exact modern categories. A faint scent of oil and dust follows you deeper as the first gate closes behind the goddess. The missing crown changes her silhouette. Nothing else has yet been removed, so she is still richly equipped. That makes the first loss especially noticeable. She remains recognizable, powerful, and composed. But something fundamental has shifted. The highest marker of sovereignty is gone, and the underworld has demonstrated that it can redefine the terms of recognition. There is a quirky parallel in Mesopotamian royal culture. Kings were sometimes represented in art wearing specific headgear that communicated authority instantly to viewers who understood the visual language. Divine figures could also be identified through horned crowns or distinctive garments. A modern museum visitor may see only an interesting hat. An ancient observer might have seen office, sacred legitimacy and cosmic hierarchy, clothing was information. This makes the first gate unusually suitable for symbolic interpretation. If memory erasure is imagined not as amnesia, but as the loss of identity categories, then the crown could represent the first category removed. You still remember your life, yet the position that organized that life no longer applies. A queen without a kingdom may remember ruling perfectly while becoming powerless to command. The difference between remembering authority and possessing authority becomes painfully clear. For a moment, consider how much of your own identity depends upon recognition from others. A name gains force because people respond to it. A profession matters because institutions acknowledge it. A title survives because a community agrees it means something. Remove the witnesses, the symbols, and the social structure, and those identities begin to float without support. Ancient Mesopotamians understood status with particular sharpness because hierarchy shaped legal rights, labour obligations, temple roles, and economic life. The crown therefore sits at the boundary between private self and public identity. It is worn by one person, but its meaning depends upon everyone else. This makes it a powerful first object to surrender. The underworld does not begin by taking breath or speech. It begins by taking recognition. A fringe interpretation pushes this idea much further. Some modern spiritual writers suggest that souls entering another state must first forget rank, prestige, and previous social position. In this framework, the crown symbolizes the first veil placed over memory before rebirth. Kings and servants would enter the next life without remembering who once commanded whom. Such a system carries philosophical appeal because it imagines rebirth as a radical leveling process. The difficulty is evidence. No surviving Sumerian line states that every human soul loses memories of social status at a first rebirth gate. Inanna is a goddess undergoing a unique mythic descent. Not an ordinary deceased person following a universal reincarnation procedure. The crown can reasonably symbolize authority. Turning that symbolism into a precise stage of soul memory erasure requires an additional step that the ancient text itself does not provide. Still, the speculative idea reveals something psychologically interesting. Human identity is layered. Social position is one layer, personal relationships another, bodily awareness another, emotional attachment another. Ancient ritual stories often dramatize transformation by removing these layers symbolically. Whether the Sumerians intended a complete psychology of the self remains uncertain, but the structure naturally invites such reading. Scholars studying ancient religion frequently warn against assuming that symbols have one fixed meaning. A crown can represent kingship, divine legitimacy as ceremonial status, victory, sacred favour, or simple rank depending upon context. Inanna herself combines several forms of authority, so the removed headpiece may resonate across multiple levels at once. The underworld may be stripping political sovereignty and divine privilege simultaneously. You notice another subtle point. Inanna does not receive a replacement. Nothing compensates for the loss. She simply proceeds. This creates a one-directional movement in which each threshold reduces visible identity without immediately creating a new one. Transformation begins through subtraction. The first stage is therefore best understood cautiously. The authentic ancient action is the removal of the crown. The strongest historical interpretation concerns authority and status. The memory reading remains a modern possibility layered onto that event. Yet even without accepting reincarnation theory, the symbolism remains haunting because authority is one of the strongest ways human beings tell themselves who they are. Take away the title and the memories remain. Take away recognition and certainty begins to tremble. The goddess continues downward without the object that once proclaimed her place in the world. carrying the knowledge of who she is into a realm that has already stopped acknowledging it. The second removal changes the language of the body more quietly. Inanna loses another piece of her divine regalia, one associated in the surviving sequence with ornament and protected presence rather than sovereign command. The exact item is rendered differently by translators because ancient terminology can resist neat modern equivalents, but the important feature remains clear. Something worn close to the upper body is taken away, and the descent becomes more intimate. Power is no longer being reduced only through public symbols. The body itself begins to look increasingly exposed. You can almost feel the difference through touch. A piece of metal, stone, or worked ornament leaves the skin, and the absence is noticeable precisely because the body had grown accustomed to its weight. Ancient jewellery was not merely decorative excess. In Mesopotamian art, ornaments could indicate divine status, wealth, protection, ritual identity, and access to privileged spaces. Archaeologists have recovered elaborate necklaces, beads, earrings, and headdresses from elite burials, revealing a society where ornament carried social meaning alongside beauty. Research connected with the University of Pennsylvania has helped illuminate the extraordinary craftsmanship of Mesopotamian jewellery through excavations at Erasure, gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, shell, and other materials were transported across remarkable distances before becoming ceremonial objects. These materials link the wearer to networks stretching far beyond a single city. A necklace could therefore represent more than decoration. It could embody wealth, connection, prestige, and participation in a larger sacred economy. For a moment, the scented dust gives way to cold mineral air. The passage narrows, and the body becomes more noticeable because fewer layers separate skin from the surrounding darkness. Inanna still moves with intention, but each removal changes how she occupies space. She no longer enters as an untouched visitor. The underworld is beginning to alter her appearance according to its own logic, and that alteration brings us toward the speculative idea of perception. Modern interpreters sometimes describe this stage as the weakening of how the self sees itself and the world. The reasoning is psychological rather than textual. Ornament helps shape identity through reflection and recognition. Remove the visible signs associated with beauty, protection, or sacred distinction, and perception may become less secure. You remain the same person internally, yet the world no longer mirrors back the same image. This is a subtle form of destabilization. Human beings understand themselves partly through repeated confirmation. Mirrors, clothing, gestures, titles, surroundings, and the reactions of other people all reinforce a particular image of the self. Ancient societies understood this through ceremonial dress with particular intensity. A priest dressed differently from a labourer. A ruler appeared differently from a merchant. A deity was recognized through distinctive attributes. Appearance was not superficial, it was communication. The fringe interpretation grows from that foundation. Some modern esoteric readings propose that the second gate removes not literal eyesight but interpretive perception, the mental filter through which previous identity is recognized. In that model, the soul begins to lose certainty about how reality should be understood. Memory has not vanished entirely, but its supporting framework weakens, familiar categories become unreliable, what once seemed obvious no longer feels stable. There is no ancient passage stating this directly. That matters. The surviving text rewards an object being taken, not a faculty of perception being extracted from consciousness. Yet the symbolic possibility remains intriguing because perception is rarely separate from memory. You recognize a face because memory gives that face meaning. You understand a city because memory organizes its streets. You know danger because earlier experience teaches you what to notice. If those associations begin to loosen, the world becomes unfamiliar without physically changing. A doorway remains a doorway, but perhaps you no longer know what lies beyond it. A voice remains audible, but perhaps you cannot place the speaker. A symbol remains visible, but its significance fades. This is the kind of gradual disorientation modern interpreters imagine when mapping the 7 gates onto stages of forgetting. Scholars studying Mesopotamian religion remain more cautious. Open debate continues over whether each removed object should be assigned an independent symbolic meaning, or whether the cumulative stripping matters more than precise one-to-one correspondence. Some researchers prefer to understand the sequence as ritual humiliation or reduction of divine power. Others see literary symbolism connected with entering a domain where ordinary protections cannot operate. The text permits interpretation, but it does not provide a tidy explanatory key. A quirky detail from Mesopotamian protective practice makes the question more interesting. People commonly used amulets, figurines, inscriptions, and ritual objects to guard against illness, misfortune, and hostile supernatural forces. Protection could be worn, buried, placed beside doors, or incorporated into household rituals. The boundary between ornament and protection was therefore not always sharp. An object could be beautiful and defensive at the same time. Imagine entering a place where such protections gradually disappear. The experience would not only alter appearance, it might also change emotional confidence. You would feel less shielded, less certain that familiar safeguards still apply. The second removal can therefore be read as a loss of protection, without assuming literal memory. Erasure. Vulnerability itself changes perception because danger looks different when defenses are gone. The body notices first. Skin becomes more exposed. Air feels colder. Sounds seem closer. The mind follows, adjusting to a world where previous expectations no longer hold. Inanna is not described as confused, but the structure of the descent allows modern listeners to imagine how identity might narrow under repeated loss. This is where the rebirth interpretation becomes especially seductive. Many modern spiritual systems imagine birth as a process of forgetting some previous state of knowledge. If consciousness once possessed wider awareness, then entering embodied life would require narrowing perception. The second gate can then be turned into a symbolic mechanism for that narrowing. The soul sees less because it remembers less. It is a compelling story. It is also an interpretive construction. The ancient narrative gives no universal law stating that every soul must lose a layer of perception before returning to life. Mesopotamian beliefs about the dead generally focused on continued existence in the underworld, proper burial, offerings, and relationships between the living and deceased. Reincarnation does not occupy the central position that later spiritual systems sometimes assign to it. The seven-gate reading, therefore, requires ideas drawn from outside the plain Sumerian context. Yet the second removal still possesses psychological depth without requiring reincarnation. It suggests that identity depends upon protection and recognition as much as command. When those things disappear, the self must continue without familiar supports. The descent becomes an experiment in subtraction. You begin to sense why later readers were drawn toward memory theories. The story does not present one catastrophic destruction of identity. It gives you ordered losses, each capable of carrying symbolic meaning. That structure practically invites the mind to assign inner faculties to external objects. One stage can become status, another can become perception, another can become desire or confidence. The pattern feels almost designed for psychological interpretation, even when the original text does not confirm such a system. The strongest reading remains layered rather than absolute. The ancient action concerns the removal of regalia. The historical context suggests status, protection, and sacred identity. The modern symbolic reading links these qualities to perception and self-recognition. None of these interpretations needs to erase the others completely. Inanna continues deeper while the world around her becomes less familiar through accumulation of absence. She still knows where she is going. She still moves toward the realm below, yet the visible structures that once confirmed what kind of being she was are beginning to thin. And when protection begins to disappear, perception often changes with it. The third removal reaches closer to the question of personal power. Inanna loses another object from her ceremonial dress, and the cumulative effect begins to change the entire balance of the descent. The surviving poem does not explain the item through a modern psychological vocabulary. It simply records the loss as part of the underworld's required order. Yet ancient regalia often carried meanings tied to legitimacy, vitality, divine propulsion, and the right to act. When such objects disappear one by one, the story begins to resemble the dismantling of agency itself. You can imagine the quiet weight of that idea settling around the body. Power is not only the ability to command others, it is also the feeling that your choices matter. It appears in the confidence to speak, to move, to insist, and to expect a result. Inanna is famous in Mesopotamian literature for precisely this kind of force. She acts decisively, challenges boundaries, manipulates circumstances, and rarely behaves like someone waiting politely for permission. The underworld changes that pattern by placing her inside a system where action no longer guarantees control. Mainstream historical study supports the importance of divine insignia within Mesopotamian religion. Scholars at institutions such as Yale University and the University of Chicago have shown how gods and rulers were represented through staffs, rings, garments, crowns, weapons, and other symbols associated with office. These items made authority visible. A viewer did not need an explanatory inscription to understand that certain figures possess greater status. Visual order communicated political order. This is where the third gate becomes especially suggestive. If an object associated with authority is removed, then the loss can be understood as more than a change in appearance. It may symbolize reduced capacity to exercise power within the realm below. The underworld is not merely taking what Inanna owns, it is steadily limiting what she can be. The distinction between possession and capacity is important. You can lose a tool and still retain the skill to use it. You can lose a title and still remember the knowledge that once came with it. But when every outward support disappears, even retained knowledge can become difficult to express. Authority without recognition becomes fragile. Skill without opportunity becomes suient. Intention without power becomes frustration. Modern psychological interpretations sometimes map this stage onto the weakening of will. In that reading, the third gate does not erase a specific memory, but dissolves the force that allows remembered identity to become action. You may still know who you were, but you cannot make the surrounding world respond to that knowledge. A remembered command becomes only a thought. That possibility feels strangely familiar. Human beings often experience identity through effective action. You decide to stand, listen, and the body responds. You speak, and someone listens. You reach for an object, and your hand closes around it. Agency is woven so deeply into ordinary consciousness that its loss can feel like a loss of self. Ancient myth does not need modern terminology to dramatize this. It only needs a powerful goddess entering a place where power steadily stops working. The poem itself remains restrained. It does not say that Inanna loses willpower, determination, or mental control at this stage. It does not list a sequence of invisible faculties being deleted from consciousness. The narrative gives you objects, movement, repeated rules, and a destination. Everything beyond that must be interpreted carefully. The scholarly debate here is not whether the stripping occurs. That is clear. The open question concerns how specifically each item should be matched to a separate divine function. Some historians interpret the entire sequence collectively as the removal of royal and sacred status. Others allow that individual objects may have carried distinctive meanings, now only partly understood. The problem is that ancient audiences had access to cultural associations that surviving texts do not always explain. A quirky detail from Mesopotamian religion helps reveal how complex these associations could become. Divine power was sometimes imagined through special decrees, offices, objects, and qualities that belong to the ordered structure of civilization itself. Myths could describe gods possessing authority over kingship, craft, wisdom, warfare, music, sexuality, or judgment. Power was therefore not always pictured as an abstract energy. It could be organized into roles and recognizable functions. This makes the idea of losing power in stages less strange within an ancient context, though not necessarily in the way modern spiritual writers describe it. Inanna's authority may be dismantled through the removal of visible signs because those signs belong to a network of divine identity. Each object lost weakens the total image. Your ears catch the soft sound of another ornament being handled. Perhaps metal touches stone. Perhaps fabric brushes against skin. The gatekeeper completes the required act without explaining its deeper symbolism. Inanna continues, and the space around her seems to absorb another portion of what once made her formidable. A fringe interpretation goes much further. Some modern readers describe the third stage as the erasure of personal power memory, meaning the remembered sense of influence, competence, and control accumulated through a previous existence. In such a system, rebirth would require forgetting not only who you were, but what you were capable of doing. A ruler would forget command. A warrior would forget confidence. A priest would forget authority. A wealthy person would forget privilege. This theory has obvious narrative appeal because it explains why a reborn person would not immediately resume a previous identity. If consciousness retained every skill, ambition, and expectation unchanged, a new life would be overwhelmed by the old one. Forgetting power would therefore become a kind of reset. The difficulty remains historical. Sumerian sources do not present a documented rebirth mechanism operating through 7 memory deletions. The third gate contains no preserved statement identifying personal power as a removable memory layer. The interpretation is modern, even when inspired by an ancient structure. Still, the idea exposes a deeper question about continuity of identity. Suppose memories survive but agency did not. Would you still be the same person if you remembered commanding armies, but could not control your own circumstances? Would the memory preserve identity or slowly dissolve it? If you remembered great wealth but possessed nothing, would the memory strengthen you or torment you? Ancient literature often explores transformation through reversal. Kings become helpless, strong figures become dependent, the protected become exposed. Inanna's descent belongs naturally within that pattern. Her growing vulnerability becomes meaningful because it reverses the qualities associated with her above ground. The psychological reading therefore does not need to be accepted as ancient doctrine to remain useful. It reveals how the story can speak across time without pretending that modern interpretations were written into the original clay. The third stage can be understood historically as another loss of regalia and symbolically as a weakening of agency. The two readings can coexist as long as the difference between them stays clear. You feel the atmosphere becoming heavier, not because the story grows louder, but because choices seem to carry less force. Inanna still moves, she still possesses intention, yet the underworld has shown that intention alone cannot restore what has been taken. There is a quiet terror in that realization. Identity is not built only from memory. It also depends upon the ability to act according to memories. A name matters because you can answer to it. A skill matters because you can perform it. A role matters because you can inhabit it. When power fades, memory remains, but it becomes less useful. And in the deepening silhouette of the underworld, the difference between knowing who you are and being able to live as that person begins to narrow. The fourth removal draws the descent toward desire, attachment, and the bonds that make life feel worth returning to. Inanna loses another part of her divine adornment, and the symbolism becomes increasingly intimate. Ancient Mesopotamian religion did not separate love, fertility, sexuality, power, and social order into isolated categories as neatly as modern systems often do. Inanna herself embodies several of these forces at once. When an ornament associated with her embodied presence disappears, the loss can suggest more than status. It can suggest a weakening of the ties that connect identity to longing. You can imagine the underworld becoming quieter in a different way. The silence is not only around the body now, it seems to move inward, touching preference and appetite. Human beings organize much of life through desire. You want warmth, food, companionship, recognition, safety, intimacy, movement, memory, and meaning. Desire pulls the self forward through time. Without it, identity becomes strangely static. A person may remember everything and still feel detached from every remembered thing. Mainstream historians of Mesopotamian religion have long emphasized Inanna's connection with erotic love and fertility, alongside her roles in warfare and kingship. Research associated with institutions such as Oxford University and Yale University has explored how her hymns portray attraction, courtship, abundance, and divine power as intertwined. This context makes any loss within her ceremonial body especially significant. The goddess associated with intense desire is entering a place where ordinary appetites cannot function normally. The surviving underworld narrative does not say that desire is literally removed from her mind. There is no statement explaining that a specific emotional faculty vanishes at this point. Yet the cumulative stripping creates a powerful symbolic possibility. If identity is built partly from what one loves, wants, and seeks, then weakening those attachments begins to alter the self from within. A modern interpreter might call this the fading of emotional memory. That phrase does not mean forgetting events in the ordinary sense. You could still remember a person while losing the feeling attached to that memory. A face might remain clear while affection disappears. A familiar place might remain recognizable while nostalgia falls silent. Memory without emotion becomes strangely flat, almost like reading Pomenel's biographer. This distinction matters because neuroscience also recognizes that memory and emotion are closely connected. Although ancient Mesopotamians did not describe the brain through modern scientific language. Research from major universities such as Stanford University has shown how emotional significance can influence which experiences are remembered strongly. The ancient poem does not anticipate modern neuroscience, but the symbolic relationship remains compelling. What you care about affects what you remember, and what you remember shapes what you care about. A quirky Mesopotamian detail adds another layer. Love poetry associated with Inanna can be surprisingly vivid and playful, celebrating attraction, perfume, clothing, gardens, beds, and bodily beauty. These compositions remind you that ancient religious literature was not always solemn. Divine love could be sensual, affectionate, competitive, and even humorous. The same goddess who dominates battlefields could also inhabit songs of desire with remarkable tenderness. That makes the underworld's stripping feel more severe. Ornament and fragrance belong to the world of courtship, ceremony, and recognition. Darkness removes the setting in which those things matter. There are no admiring crowds here, no festival procession waits, no lover is impressed by fine clothing. The underworld reduces value systems built upon the living body. The scholarly debate becomes especially delicate at this stage. Some researchers read the descent as a political and theological conflict between divine sisters. Others emphasize ritual humiliation or the transformation of a fertility deity. Still others question older interpretations that link the story too directly with seasonal vegetation cycles. Modern scholarship increasingly resists forcing every element into one explanation. Ancient myths often carry several functions at once. This caution becomes useful when dealing with the idea of 7 memory erasures. Desire is an attractive category for a stage system because attachment seems essential to personal identity. If rebirth required leaving a former life behind, then emotional bonds would pose an obvious problem. A soul remembering every love, grief, rivalry, and obligation might struggle to enter a new life freely. Modern spiritual readings, therefore, sometimes imagine that the emotional attachment must be weakened before rebirth can occur. It is possible to understand why such an idea developed. Human beings already know how powerful attachment can be, though grief can keep a person mentally tied to someone absent for years. Love can shape choices long after circumstances change. Resentment can preserve an old conflict with astonishing durability. If memory survives death in a speculative system, emotion would likely be the strongest thread connecting one existence to another. Yet the Sumerian narrative does not describe a universal process of emotional cleansing. Inanna's descent is particular to her mythic role and divine conflict. The removed objects belong to her body and status. Translating those objects into exact psychological stages requires interpretive choices that ancient scribes never explain. For a moment, imagine desire fading gradually rather than disappearing at once. The scent of herbs no longer stirs hunger. Music no longer awakens longing. A familiar voice does not tighten the chest. Beauty remains visible but loses urgency. The world still exists, yet the self no longer reaches toward it with the same intensity. That kind of fading would transform identity profoundly. People often describe themselves through preferences. You are someone who loves certain places, avoids certain people, misses certain years, values certain traditions, and fears certain losses. Remove the emotional charge from those associations, and your biography remains while your sense of ownership weakens. A fringe theory treats this stage as the point where attachment memory is erased. In that model, the soul stops identifying with relationships from a previous life. Family bonds, ambitions, romantic attachments, and old grievances lose their emotional force. The purpose would be to prevent previous loyalties from dominating the next existence. There is no direct Sumerian evidence confirming such a mechanism. The theory is modern. Still, it reveals why the descent continues to attract psychological interpretation. The structure invites questions about how much of the self depends on external signs and how much depends on inward attachment. Mesopotamian funerary beliefs add complexity. The dead were generally thought to continue existing in the underworld and could remain connected to living relatives through offerings and remembrance. Family relationships were not simply erased from religious imagination. The living cared for the dead through ritual, and neglect could have consequences. This makes a complete doctrine of emotional forgetting before immediate rebirth difficult to reconcile with a mainstream Mesopotamian typical evidence. The contrast is revealing. Ancient belief often emphasizes continued identity among the dead, while modern reincarnation readings emphasize identity being dissolved and restarted. The same descent story can therefore be placed inside very different spiritual frameworks depending on the interpreter. You sense the tension between these possibilities as another ornament disappears. The physical action is simple. The symbolic implications are not. Inanna is still present, still moving, still recognizable to the story. Yet another connection between her identity and the living world has been weakened. Perhaps desire is not being erased at all. Perhaps the poem is showing something more basic and more ancient, that the underworld does not honour the values that dominate life: beauty, prestige, attraction, ambition, and attachment lose force there because the environment itself changes what matters. And when desire grows quiet, memory can remain perfectly clear while feeling strangely distant. Identity becomes unstable when the signs that usually hold it together begin to loosen. Inanna continues through the ordered darkness, while another element of her divine presentation is removed, and the effect is increasingly difficult to describe as simple loss of clothing. A person recognizes herself through memory, but also through posture, ritual, place, possession, expectation, and the reaction of others. Ancient Mesopotamian society made these connections visible everywhere. Rank could be displayed through dress, jewellery, seals, attendance, architecture, and access to sacred spaces. Remove enough of those signals, and even a powerful figure can begin to appear socially unmoored. You can feel the atmosphere becoming strangely impersonal. The underworld does not insult Inanna with shouted accusations. It does something colder. It stops acknowledging the language through which her identity normally operates. The things that announce her importance are gradually taken away, while the gatekeeper continues according to procedure. No crowd witnesses her magnificence. No priest proclaims her titles. No city wall carries her emblem. Her identity still exists within the story, but fewer visible signs now support it. Mainstream historical research helps explain why this matters. Mesopotamian elites used cylinder seals, inscriptions, garments, titles, and household affiliations to establish social identity in practical ways. Scholars at institutions such as the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Chicago have shown how seals functioned almost like signatures, linking individuals to administrative actions and legal responsibility. A seal could identify the person behind a transaction without requiring physical presence. Identity was therefore something that could be impressed into clay and recognized by others. That makes the gradual loss of recognizable attributes especially powerful. Ancient identity was not merely inward, it was relational. You were someone's child, someone's spouse, a member of a household, an official of a temple, a servant of a palace, a resident of a city, or a devotee of a particular god. A person's place in the world existed within networks of obligation and recognition. Remove the network, and the self becomes harder to define. Modern interpreters sometimes call this stage the erosion of personal identity. In that reading, the process moves beyond losing authority or emotional attachment. The deeper question becomes whether the individual can continue to say, with certainty, "This is who I am." The idea is not stated directly in the ancient poem, yet it feels psychologically natural because identity is built from accumulated associations. Imagine remembering your name while everything that makes the name meaningful begins to fade. The sound remains familiar, but its history weakens. You remember a house, yet no longer feel that it was your. You recall a face, but cannot remember why it mattered. You know that a title once belonged to you, but the title feels like something read on a tablet belonging to another person. Nothing has vanished completely, ownership has simply become uncertain. This distinction between memory and identification is subtle. You can possess information without experiencing it as self-knowledge. Modern psychology recognizes that autobiographical memory and identity are deeply connected. Though the Sumerians expressed selfhood through very different concepts, a memory becomes part of identity when the mind says, "This happened to me." Remove that sense of ownership, and the remembered event can remain while the self begins to detach from it. The ancient narrative creates an environment perfectly suited to such interpretation because each removal weakens external continuity. Inanna is still Inanna, but she increasingly lacks the objects that make that fact visible. The underworld treats her not according to the honours she carries from above, but according to its own rules. Her identity is becoming less socially useful. A quirky detail from Mesopotamian legal culture makes this even more interesting. Personal identity could sometimes be established through family relationships, witnesses, property records, and seal impressions rather than through anything resembling modern identification documents. If disputes arose, communities depended upon remembered relationships and recorded transactions. Identity lived partly in the memory of other people. This raises an unsettling possibility. What happens to identity when no one around you confirms it? Imagine entering a realm where no one cares who your father was, what office you held, which fields belonged to your household, or what temple once honoured you. You may remember everything, yet the environment refuses to validate any of it. Identity becomes private testimony without witnesses. Scholars continue debating how literally the removed objects should be mapped onto distinct aspects of selfhood. Some interpretations see a cumulative humiliation of a goddess attempting to enter another deity's domain. Others emphasize the surrender of divine powers or ritual protections. Still others read the sequence through political imagery, with each removal reducing sovereign status. The surviving text does not provide a glossary explaining what each object means, so certainty remains impossible. That uncertainty has encouraged fringe theories to become increasingly elaborate. Some modern spiritual systems describe 7 layers of identity being removed before rebirth, including social role, sensory perception, personal power, attachment, personality, memory, and final self-recognition. Such systems often appear impressively symmetrical when presented in diagrams. The problem is that the symmetry usually belongs to the modern interpreter rather than the ancient tablet. The 5th stage in these reconstructions is often described as the loss of personality memory. The soul allegedly stops remembering the patterns that once made it unique, such as preferences, habits, fears, mannerisms, loyalties, and temperament. This would create a deeper reset than simply forgetting status. A person could no longer carry the emotional style of a former existence into a new one. There is no direct Sumerian statement confirming this process. The underworld story is not written as a manual for reincarnation, yet the theory persists because it answers a difficult question within any rebirth system. If someone returns to life, why do they not behave exactly as before? Memory erasure offers one answer. Personality dissolution offers another. The more interesting historical reading may be that the descent dramatizes what happens when identity loses its social supports. Ancient Mesopotamian selfhood was embedded in community, household, profession, cult, and political structure. Removal from those structures could represent a profound form of diminishment. The dead, by definition, no longer participate fully in the institutions of the living. For a moment, imagine the underworld not as a place that destroys the self, but as a place that makes the self irrelevant. That is quieter and perhaps more disturbing. You still know who you are, but the knowledge no longer changes anything. Your name opens no door. Your wealth purchases nothing. Your reputation carries no weight. Your relationships cannot intervene. Identity survives, but its practical force fades. This possibility fits the atmosphere of the descent better than sudden amnesia. The goddess is not shown collapsing into confusion at each threshold. She remains aware enough to question the removals and continue. What changes is the degree to which her former world still has authority around her. The body keeps moving while identity becomes increasingly difficult to display. You should begin to sense why later readers imagined memory beneath the symbolism. If the outward self can be stripped layer by layer, perhaps the inward self can be imagined the same way. Maybe the ancient poem is not describing erased memory at all. maybe it is describing something even stranger. It may be showing how a person can remember perfectly and still become progressively less able to prove that the remembered person is truly themselves. The sixth removal brings Inanna close to a condition where almost nothing remains between her body and the law of the underworld. The sequence has become severe enough that the meaning no longer depends on any single object. What matters now is accumulation. Each loss has narrowed the distance between divine privilege and bare vulnerability. Inanna continues to move, but the visual language of status, protection, and sacred identity has been almost completely dismantled. The underworld does not need to destroy her in one sudden act. It simply keeps reducing what she's allowed to carry. You can imagine the sensation of unfamiliar lightness. Clothing and ornaments that once felt natural have disappeared, leaving the body exposed to cooler air and rougher surroundings. The absence of weight becomes its own presence. Every remaining object matters more because there are so few left. The underworld seems to measure identity through subtraction, and the method is patient. Nothing is hurried, nothing needs spectacle. Mainstream scholarship on Mesopotamian religion often interprets the deeds as cumulative stripping as part of Inanna's loss of divine authority within Ereshkigal's realm. Researchers at institutions such as the University of Chicago and Oxford University have explored how Mesopotamian gods could possess powers, offices, symbols, and attributes that define their roles. Entering another divine jurisdiction could therefore involve a real reduction in effectiveness. A goddess might remain divine in name while becoming unable to exercise her accustomed power. This distinction is important because vulnerability does not require forgetfulness. Inanna can still remember who she is while losing the means to behave as she once did. A person trapped without tools does not forget how tools work. A ruler without subjects does not forget how commands are spoken. A traveller stripped of possessions does not forget what was taken. Yet memory without practical support can begin to feel unreal, especially when the surrounding world refuses to recognize it. The sixth stage in modern memory erasure theories is often described as the weakening of deep personal memory. In some versions, this means losing knowledge of previous experiences. In others, it means forgetting the emotional and social framework that made those experiences coherent. The soul allegedly reaches a point where fragments remain but no longer assemble into a stable biography. The idea is dramatic, but the Sumerian text does not describe such a process directly. A stranger detail complicates things further. Mesopotamian thought did not usually treat the human person as one indivisible unit in the way many modern philosophical systems do. Names, bodies, ghosts, family identity, reputation, and divine relationships could all contribute to continued existence. After death, remembrance by the living also mattered. A person could remain socially present through ritual even when physically absent. Identity therefore extended beyond private memory. This means that forgetting, if imagined at all, would not necessarily equal annihilation. A dead person might continue to exist through name, descendants, offerings, and ritual relationships. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian burial practice shows how seriously communities treated care for the dead. Food, drink, and remembrance could maintain bonds across the boundary of death. The dead were not always imagined as erased personality waiting to begin again. That historical context makes the rebirth interpretation difficult to accept literally. If the sixth gate truly represented universal memory destruction, one might expect clearer evidence elsewhere in Mesopotamian funerary religion. Instead, surviving texts more often describe the dead as continuing in an underworld state where family connections and ritual obligations still matter. The picture is one of continuity altered by death, not simple recycling into another earthly life. For a moment, you hear water dripping somewhere beyond sight. The sound repeats with such patience that time itself seems uncertain. Inanna has entered a place where ordinary measures no longer feel reliable. Above ground, days can be counted through sunlight and labour. Here, distance is marked by gates and surrender. The body continues forward while the familiar world becomes conceptually remote. This is where psychological interpretation becomes more interesting than literal memory theory. The sixth removal can represent the point where identity has lost almost all external reinforcement. Even if every memory remains, there may be nothing left to confirm those memories. No familiar room surrounds you. No family voice calls your name. No object carries personal history. No social role requires performance. The self becomes almost entirely internal. Modern psychology recognizes that memory is often triggered by context. A smell can summon childhood. A particular room can restore a forgotten conversation. Music can revive emotions that seemed absent for decades. Human memory is not simply stored as a perfect internal archive waiting to be opened. It is connected to cues, environments, and repeated associations. Remove the cues, and memories can become harder to access. The ancient poem does not contain this modern explanation, but the symbolic overlap is striking. Inanna's surroundings provide fewer and fewer reminders of who she was above. The underworld gives her no supportive context. Everything familiar is being replaced by a landscape governed by another queen and another order, even without literal erasure. This could feel like a gradual fading of self. An open scholarly debate remains over whether the 7 removals correspond to distinct powers, or whether their real meaning lies in the total sequence. Some historians caution against assigning precise psychological meanings to individual objects. Others argue that specific regalia must have carried recognizable religious associations for ancient audiences. The evidence supports careful interpretation but not absolute certainty. A fringe view proposes something more elaborate. It suggests that the 6th gate represents the breaking of autobiographical continuity, the point where a soul can no longer assemble remembered events into a single lifetime. In this model, memories survive briefly as isolated impressions. A face appears without a name. A city is remembered without belonging. A feeling remains without its cause. Rebirth then becomes possible because the old life has lost narrative unity. There is no surviving Sumerian statement that confirms this sequence. Yet the idea reveals how modern minds think about identity. We do not experience life as disconnected facts. We experience it as a story. Childhood leads to adulthood. Relationships create consequences. Decisions become turning points. Memory binds separate moments into the impression of one continuous person. If that binding weakens, the self may feel fragmented even before individual memories disappear. This possibility gives the 6th stage a different kind of unease. Forgetting everything at once would be simple. Forgetting the connections between things would be far stranger. Inanna now stands almost emptied of the symbols that once organized her divine presence. She has not become nothing, but the distinction between what she remembers and what the underworld recognizes has grown painfully thin. Almost every visible statement of identity has been challenged. The 6th gate therefore carries a quiet psychological possibility. Perhaps the deepest loss is not a vanished memory. Perhaps it is the loss of the thread that tells you how separate memories belong together. And when that thread begins to loosen, even a complete life can start to feel like someone else's dream. The 7th gate leaves no room for ambiguity about the direction of the descent. Inanna's final garment is removed, and the sequence reaches its most complete state of exposure. By this point, the underworld has taken every visible layer that once separated divine splendor from the physical vulnerability. The act is not described as a philosophical lesson, yet its power comes from how little remains to interpret. A body stands where royal presentation once stood, and the difference between goddess and captive has become almost unbearably thin. You can feel the stillness around this last threshold. There is no need for grand ceremony because repetition has already taught the listener what the gate means. Passage requires surrender. The final garment carries special force because clothing is the closest layer to the body. Crowns and ornaments announce status from a distance, but clothing marks the boundary between the private self and public appearance. Removing it changes not only what others see, but also how the individual experiences exposure. Mainstream scholarship often reads this final stripping as the completion of Inanna's loss of power within Ereshkigal's domain. Researchers at major universities such as Yale University and Oxford University have emphasized that Mesopotamian divine identity could be expressed through regalia, offices, and ritual attributes. By losing the last garment, Inanna reaches the point where none of those visible supports remain. The journey has not erased her existence, but it has completed the dismantling of her recognized authority. This is where many modern memory theories place the deepest form of forgetting. The seventh siddhi is sometimes described as loss of the final self-image, the point where consciousness no longer identifies with the person it once was. In such interpretations, previous stages weaken status, perception, desire, personality, and autobiographical memory. The last stage removes the remaining sense of ownership that binds those fragments together. There is no longer a clear inner statement saying, "This is me." The Sumerian text does not state this. It does not say that Inanna forgets her own name or loses awareness of her divine identity. The ancient action is the removal of her final garment. Everything else belongs to interpretation. Yet this final act naturally invites speculation because clothing has always carried strong associations with identity, modesty, protection, and social belonging. A quirky historical detail makes the symbolism even richer. Mesopotamian clothing could communicate profession, gender, wealth, ritual status, and regional identity through fabric, cut, decoration, and arrangement. Wool was central to the economy, and textile production involved enormous labour networks. Garments were not trivial objects. They represented skill, resources, household organisation, and social rank. To remove the final garment was therefore to remove an object connected with both personal dignity and the larger economy of civilization. For a moment, the underworld seems almost to reverse the process of social creation. Above ground, a person becomes visible through clothing, title, ornament, household, and role. Here, those layers disappear in the opposite direction. The result is not a return to innocence. It is a reduction into vulnerability under another power. The scholarly debate becomes especially careful at this point. Some historians interpret nakedness in the descent as humiliation. Others see ritual disempowerment, legal submission, or symbolic death. Certain researchers have compared the scene with broader ancient Near Eastern ideas about captives being stripped of status. None of these explanations needs to exclude the others completely. Ancient symbolism often works through several associations at once. The modern rebirth theory takes a different path. It imagines nakedness as the condition required for transition between lives. If every social identity must be abandoned, then clothing becomes a perfect metaphor for personality itself. You wear a life in the same way you wear a garment. It fits for a time, gathers marks of experience, becomes familiar, and eventually must be removed. The next life begins with another covering. That metaphor is powerful. It is also modern. There is no securely attested Sumerian doctrine stating that human souls remove 7 memory layers before reincarnation. Mesopotamian funerary belief generally describes the dead as continuing within an underworld existence rather than immediately entering a new earthly body. The 7 gates belong to a divine descent story, not an explicit universal rebirth ritual. Still, the final garment invites a question that reaches beyond historical proof. How much of identity is something worn? Not literally, but socially and psychologically. Names are given, roles are learned, customs are inherited, professions are practiced, personalities are reinforced through repetition. The self may feel permanent while being partly assembled from layers accumulated over time. If those layers are removed, what remains? The question is older than any modern theory. Ancient myths repeatedly place gods and heroes in situations where status disappears and basic existence becomes visible. Inanna's descent is particularly intense because the process is methodical. She does not lose everything through accident. She passes through a system designed to remove. A fringe interpretation describes the 7th gate as the destruction of ego memory. In that model, consciousness loses the final organizing center that says every remembered experience belongs to one continuous individual, the soul becomes blank enough to enter another body without contradiction. New relationships can form because old ownership has dissolved. The difficulty is that such terminology comes from much later philosophical and psychological traditions. Ancient Sumerian texts use their own concepts and categories, and forcing modern vocabulary onto them can create false precision. The story becomes more interesting when the uncertainty remains visible. You can imagine Inanna standing with nothing left to display. No symbol announces sovereignty. No ornament catches light. No fabric protects dignity. She is still the same divine figure within the narrative. Yet the underworld has stripped away every visible argument for special treatment. That may be the most important feature of the 7th gate. It does not prove memory erasure. It proves total surrender of external identity within the logic of the poem. The distinction matters because surrender can look like forgetting without actually being forgetting. The final garment disappears, and with it the old visual language ends. There is no 8th object waiting to be taken. The structure is complete. 7 gates have done their work. What remains is not a blank soul prepared for rebirth, at least not according to the surviving text. What remains is a goddess without the protections, privileges, and visible signs that once made her untouchable. And perhaps that difference is the hidden truth worth holding on to. The darkness now contains authority of a different kind. Inanna stands before the great judges of the underworld, the Inanna, whose presence turns the descent from ritual stripping into judgment. They are not merely frightening figures placed around a throne for atmosphere. Mesopotamian texts describe groups of powerful divine beings associated with cosmic order, decision-making, and the destinies of gods and humans. Their exact identities vary across periods and compositions, but their appearance in the underworld gives the scene a formal structure. The realm below is not an empty cavern. It has administration, hierarchy, and law. You can imagine the chamber as broad and strangely still, perhaps lit only by uncertain lamps or by the supernatural presence of those gathered there. Stone packed earth, and shadow absorbs sound. No familiar city noise reaches this place. The judges do not need elaborate movement to appear powerful. Their authority lies in stillness. Inanna has crossed the gates without her divine regalia, and now she faces beings whose power does not depend upon recognizing what she once wore. Mainstream historical research confirms that the Inanna appear widely in Mesopotamian religious literature. Although their roles change with context, scholars at institutions such as the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Chicago have examined how these divine groups could participate in assemblies, judgments, and the maintenance of cosmic order. In some traditions, they belong to the Great Divine Council. In others, they become closely associated with the underworld. This flexibility is typical of Mesopotamian religion. where divine functions could shift across centuries without destroying the basic identity of a god or group. That matters because modern retellings often treat the 7 underworld judges as though they formed a fixed spiritual tribunal governing reincarnation. The ancient evidence is more complicated. They judge within the story, certainly, yet there is no surviving Sumerian statement explaining that every human soul must stand before 7 judges who evaluate memories before rebirth. The scene belongs first to Inanna's confrontation with Erasure and the laws of the realm below. Still, the number is striking. 7 judges fit the same numerical atmosphere that surrounds the gates. The repetition creates a sense of completion. 1 judge might represent individual opinion. 7 suggests collective decision. Their judgment feels less like personal anger, and more like the full weight of an established order. A peculiar feature of Mesopotamian divine councils is how familiar their structure can feel. Gods assemble, debate, approve, condemn, appoint, and issue decisions. Divine society often resembles human political society enlarged to cosmic scale. This does not mean ancient people believed heaven operated exactly like a city council meeting, though the resemblance is difficult to miss. Apparently, even the supernatural world could not escape committees. The humour fades quickly because the judges possess real narrative force. They direct their gaze toward Inanna and pronounce judgment. The image is memorable because sight itself becomes an instrument of power. In many ancient cultures, divine looking can bless, curse, expose, or condemn. Here, judgment is not delivered through a long legal argument. The gaze itself carries consequence. You can feel how exposed Inanna must appear. Every visible marker of privilege has disappeared, and now attention falls directly upon her. There is no ceremonial barrier between the goddess and those evaluating her presence. The process resembles a final stripping away of mediation. She cannot hide behind office, clothing, title, or ornament. Judgment reaches the person beneath them. This is where modern psychological interpretations sometimes place a different idea of memory. Rather than claiming that the judges erase memory directly, some fringe systems suggest they evaluate what remains once identity has been stripped down. In such readings, consciousness is examined before entering another state. Memories are weighed, attachments are assessed, and the self is prepared for transformation. The ancient text does not explain such a mechanism. It gives judgment, not a detailed philosophy of reincarnation. Yet the association between judgment and memory feels natural to modern readers because moral evaluation depends upon remembering actions. To judge a life, someone must know what happened. If memory disappears entirely, responsibility becomes difficult to understand. This creates an interesting tension. A system of total memory erasure before rebirth would need some separate record of identity if judgment still mattered. The individual might forget, but the cosmos would somehow have to remember. Later religious traditions solve this problem through divine records, karmic consequences, heavenly books, or immortal souls. Mesopotamian religion also contains ideas of divine record-keeping and destiny, but not a clearly documented 7-stage reincarnation system. The scholarly debate here concerns how the Inanna function across different texts and historical periods. Some specialists emphasize their connection with major divine assemblies. Others focus on their later association with the dead and underworld judgment. Their number can vary depending on the composition. The fact that 7 appear in a particular narrative should therefore not be transformed into a universal law without further evidence. A quirky tidbit from Mesopotamian mythology adds to the complexity. Divine beings could possess overlapping names, titles, and functions, making modern attempts to create tidy family trees unexpectedly difficult. A deity prominent in one city might appear differently elsewhere. Local traditions could preserve distinct versions of relationships and responsibilities. The ancient religious world was organized, but it was not standardized in the way modern reference books prefer. You sense this complexity while imagining the judges seated in Solomon's. They belong to a divine order older than any single surviving tablet. Their presence tells you that death is not simply absence, it is jurisdiction. That idea would have felt familiar to people living within Mesopotamian cities. Law-shaped property, marriage, inheritance, debt, labour, and punishment. Written judgments could be preserved on clay. Witnesses mattered. Oaths mattered. Authority mattered. It is hardly surprising that the realm of the dead could be imagined through similarly formal structures. Yet underworld judgment in Mesopotamia should not be confused automatically with later ideas of moral heaven and hell. The dead were generally expected to enter a gloomy realm, regardless of whether they had lived exemplary lives. Status and burial conditions could affect aspects of existence, but there was no simple system where good people ascended into eternal paradise, while bad people descended into punishment. The underworld was broadly the destination of mortality itself. This makes Inanna's encounter with the judges especially severe. She's not standing before them because she is an ordinary sinner awaiting moral evaluation. She has entered a realm where her presence disrupts established boundaries. Their judgment belongs to cosmic order more than personal confession. A fringe reading transforms that moment into a universal checkpoint for consciousness. These 7 judges become guardians of 7 internal layers, evaluating whether each layer has been released. Such interpretations can sound persuasive because the number aligns neatly with the 7 gates. Yet no surviving Sumerian document lists 7 psychological categories assigned to 7 judges in exact correspondence. The historical story is less symmetrical and more mysterious. 7 gates strip, 7 judges condemn. The same number links movement and judgment, but the text does not explain whether this is deliberate theological correspondence or simply a repeated sacred pattern. You can imagine the ancient listener recognizing the structure without needing an explanation. 7 feels complete. The gates have completed the descent. The judges complete the legal response. The system closes around Inanna with almost mathematical calm. There is something unsettling in that precision. Disorder would offer hope because chaos sometimes creates escape. Order is harder. A rule that applies consistently gives little room for persuasion. The judges look upon the goddess, and the underworld finally answers her presence not with another removal but with a verdict. Memory has not yet become the central question. Judgment has. And once judgment enters the story, the mystery changes from what can be taken from a person to what remains accountable when almost everything else is gone. The chamber does not erupt into spectacle when judgment takes hold. Instead, the story moves with the terrible calm of a sentence already decided. Inanna reaches the point where movement itself is interruptible, and the descent becomes something more final than humiliation. Her body is rendered powerless, and the narrative presents her as suspended within the underworld in a state that resembles death. The symbolism is unmistakably severe. Whatever authority, beauty, desire, or identity accompanied her into this realm can no longer function through action. You can feel the stillness in your own muscles as the story settles there. Breath seems distant. The floor is cold beneath imagination. Nothing moves except the awareness that a once forceful goddess has become passive within a realm ruled by someone else. The contrast is extraordinary because Inanna is usually associated with vitality, ambition, sexuality, conflict, and political force. Here, all of that energy is brought to a halt. The transformation is not described as peaceful transcendence. It's closer to total arrest. Mainstream scholarship generally treats this moment as the narrative crisis of the descent. Researchers at institutions such as Oxford University and the University of Chicago have examined how divine death, suspension, and restoration function within Mesopotamian mythology. The scene does not prove a doctrine of reincarnation, but it clearly dramatizes a passage through a condition where normal life has ceased. That distinction matters because rebirth imagery can emerge from stories of restoration without implying that every soul repeatedly enters new bodies. Ancient myth frequently uses extreme states to explore boundaries. A god sleeps and the world suffers. A king loses power and order collapses. A deity disappears and fertility weakens. Inanna's immobilization belongs to this broader pattern. Her condition affects more than her private fate because divine beings embody forces that sustain the world around them. When such a figure becomes inactive, the consequences can spread outward. A quirky detail from Mesopotamian religion helps explain why suspended divine power could be so unsettling. Gods were often imagined as maintaining functions essential to civilization, including kingship, fertility, justice, warfare, craft, and cosmic order. Their absence could therefore become a theological problem rather than simply a personal tragedy. If a deity stopped performing a role, something within the human world might also falter. Modern fringe interpretations often identify this point as ego death. In that framework, the earlier removals represent stages of dismantling, while this final collapse represents the moment when the old self can no longer maintain continuity. Memory, desire, and agency are imagined as emptied interdience. Rebirth becomes possible only because the previous identity has effectively stopped operating. The phrase sounds modern because it is. Ancient Sumerian texts do not use contemporary psychological terminology, and that there is no surviving passage that labels Inanna's condition as destruction of the ego. Yet the metaphor persists, because the narrative does place her beyond ordinary social identity. She cannot command, she cannot display rank, she cannot negotiate with the familiar tools of power. She has been reduced to a condition where previous definitions have little practical meaning. For a moment, imagine what that would feel like without assuming literal death. Your memories remain somewhere inside you, yet nothing in the environment responds to them. You cannot act upon them. You cannot confirm them through familiar people. You cannot return to the places that gave them context. Eventually, memory might begin to feel detached from a possession. The story never says this happens to Inanna, but the psychological possibility helps explain why later readers connect the scene with dissolution of self. An open scholarly debate concerns whether Inanna's fate should be interpreted primarily through ritual death, political rivalry, cosmic order, or symbolic transformation. Some historians emphasize the confrontation between two divine powers. Others see the episode as a structured passage through humiliation and restoration. Still others caution against importing later resurrection theology into a much older Mesopotamian context. The evidence supports several overlapping readings without establishing one final solution. That ambiguity becomes especially important when the body itself turns into an object within the story. A living person acts, a dead body is acted upon. The shift from subject to object may be one of the most profound transformations the narrative contains. Inanna entered as someone who chose movement. Now, movement belongs to others. The loss of agency changes the meaning of memory here. Memory normally serves action. You remember where food is stored, whom you trust, what danger feels like, and which road leads home because remembered information guides behavior. If behavior becomes impossible, memory loses one of its main functions. It may survive, but it cannot produce consequence. This is where modern spiritual readings often imagine the final separation between consciousness and biography. The old life remains only as residue, while identity becomes quiet enough to enter another state. Such interpretations may describe the process as cleansing, release, or preparation for rebirth. The problem is historical evidence. Mesopotamian funerary traditions more commonly imagine continued existence among the dead than immediate reincarnation into new earthly lives. Still, the narrative contains a genuine transformation that requires no modern doctrine to feel profound. Inanna reaches a condition where every ordinary support of selfhood has failed. That condition creates a literary void. The audience knows she cannot remain there forever without consequences, yet nothing in her own power appears capable of reversing the sentence. The silence becomes almost physical. You hear no triumphant music, no hidden door opens, no sudden explanation arrives. The story allows the helplessness to remain in place long enough for its meaning to settle. A fringe interpretation proposes that this stillness represents complete memory suspension rather than erasure. In this model, memories are not destroyed but become inaccessible, like writing hidden beneath layers of clay. Rebirth would later restore consciousness, without restoring direct access to the old archive. This theory offers one reason people might occasionally experience dreams, intuitions, or unexplained familiarity that they interpret as traces of previous lives. There is no Sumerian evidence confirming such hidden memory storage. Yet the idea is psychologically attractive because it preserves continuity without requiring conscious recall. The person forgets, but some deeper layer supposedly remembers. Modern thinkers often prefer this solution because total erasure raises an obvious question. If nothing remains, what exactly is reborn? The ancient poem avoids that philosophical problem. It does not explain a universal soul mechanism. It tells a story about a goddess whose identity is stripped down until her own power no longer carries her forward. That difference is crucial. Transformation is certain within the narrative. Reincarnation is not. You can remain with the image for a while. A once radiant figure is motionless in a realm where status has no protective force. The body has become silent. The world above continues without her. The question is no longer how much identity can be removed while someone still remains themselves. The question is whether identity can return once the self has stopped acting altogether. The rescue begins not with force, but with preparation. Inanna cannot free herself, so another intelligence must enter the problem from outside. Her faithful minister Ninshuba carries out the instructions given before the descent and seeks help from powerful gods. The appeal eventually reaches Enki, a deity associated with wisdom, fresh water, craft, and clever solutions. His response is striking because he does not gather an army. He creates small beings designed for one purpose: to cross a boundary that ordinary power cannot easily cross. You can almost hear water moving softly through a dark chamber as Enki considers the problem. His domain is often linked with hidden knowledge and skillful intervention rather than brute command. In Mesopotamian mythology, wisdom frequently appears as the ability to understand rules well enough to bend circumstances without openly breaking cosmic order. That makes his solution especially fitting. The underworld cannot simply be stormed, or its laws must be approached from within. Mainstream scholarship recognizes Enki as one of the major gods of Mesopotamia, associated with wisdom, creation, fresh water, ritual knowledge, and technical skill. Researchers at institutions such as Yale University and the University of Chicago have long emphasized how often he appears in myths as a problem solver. He is not always the strongest divine figure in a scene, but he often becomes the one who understands how survival can still be arranged. His method is peculiar. Enki fashions two unusual beings whose identities do not fit ordinary social categories. These helpers are not heroic warriors, radiant gods, or royal messengers. They are small, liminal figures, created to enter a place where ordinary assumptions fail, their very strangeness becomes useful. A quirky detail appears here because the beings are instructed not to behave like conventional visitors. They are told how to respond to Erasure suffering with sympathy rather than demand. When she cries out, they echo her pain. When she groans, they answer with understanding. Their success depends upon emotional intelligence rather than intimidation. That choice changes the atmosphere completely. The underworld has resisted titles, ornaments, command, and divine privilege, but it responds to recognition. Erasure is not overcome by violence. She is met in her pain. The beings mirror her distress until she becomes receptive to them. This is one of the most unusual reversals in the entire narrative because rescue depends upon listening. You can imagine the chamber filled with harsh breath and exhausted sound. Erasure suffers, and the strange visitors do not interrupt her with demands. They remain close to the rhythm of her discomfort. Their response creates a bond where no bond seemed possible. Empathy becomes a kind of ritual technology. Scholars debate how this scene should be understood. Some interpret Erasure suffering as connected with birth, a death, or bodily crisis. Others treat it as the literary device showing vulnerability in the ruler of the dead. Another line of interpretation focuses on the ritual logic of sympathetic response. There is no universal agreement because the text leaves the nature of her pain partly open. The helpers receive an offer of reward, but they refuse ordinary gifts. They do not ask for rivers, grain, clothing, or wealth. Instead, they request the body of Inanna. That request reveals their mission with remarkable precision. They have entered the underworld not to seize territory or challenge Erasure throne, but to recover one specific figure from a condition of death. Enki has also equipped them with substances capable of restoring life. These are often rendered in translation as life-giving food and life-giving water. The wording varies slightly between modern translations, but the narrative purpose is clear. The dead body receives what ordinary food and drink cannot provide. This moment deserves careful attention because modern rebirth theories often treat Inanna's revival as proof of reincarnation. The ancient story says something different. Inanna does not awaken in a new body. She does not become a new person. She is restored as herself. Her identity continues across the interruption. That distinction changes the meaning of the whole event. Reincarnation normally implies the transition of a soul or consciousness into another embodied existence. Restoration means the return of the same figure from a state resembling death. The Sumerian narrative clearly supports restoration. It does not clearly describe the transfer of Inanna into another human life. For a moment, imagine how different those two ideas feel. In reincarnation, the old identity may be hidden or replaced. In restoration, the old identity returns. Memory, relationship, and continuity remain attached to the same divine person. Inanna does not emerge asking who she is. She resumes the consequences of the same story. This creates a serious gastentem for the theory of 7 memory erasures. If each gate had completely deleted one layer of consciousness, then restoration would require those layers to be rebuilt somehow. Yet the poem does not describe a reverse sequence where 7 memories are reinstalled in exact order. It describes a recovery achieved through divine intervention. A fringe interpretation attempts to solve this by suggesting that the removed layers were suppressed rather than destroyed. In that model, the gates temporarily deactivate identity while the deeper self remains intact. The life-giving substances then reactivate what was hidden. This reading is imaginative and psychologically elegant, but the ancient text never explained such a system. The stronger historical reading is simpler. Inanna is stripped, judged, rendered lifeless, and then revived through ritual intelligence provided by Enki. The story emphasizes rescue through knowledge, timing, sympathy, and specially prepared agents. Nothing about the rescue resembles an automatic cycle that every deceased person undergoes. That point matters because automatic systems behave predictably. The sun rises, seasons return, and rivers flood, and a universal rebirth mechanism would normally be expected to operate without one specific god inventing a rescue plan. Inanna survives precisely because someone intervenes. You sense how fragile the return really is. No law guarantees it. No gatekeeper offers it automatically. No judge announces a scheduled restoration. A loyal servant seeks help. A wise god devises a method. Unusual beings cross the boundary. A ruler of the underworld grants access to the body. Life-giving substances are applied. Everything depends upon circumstance. The open scholarly debate concerns whether this episode reflects ritual practices known to temple communities or remains primarily literary theology. Some researchers have compared the restoring substances with purification rites, sacred water, and ritual food. Others caution that mythological substances should not be reduced to literal ceremony. The narrative may borrow ritual language while still operating within imaginative divine storytelling. What remains unmistakable is the role of intelligence. The underworld cannot be defeated by shouting. It cannot be impressed by rank. It must be approached through knowledge of its rules and through carefully chosen behavior. The helpers succeed because they understand a weakness that power overlooks. Erasure can be reached through shared suffering. A boundary that resisted authority responds to recognition. Perhaps that is the quietest hidden lesson inside the rescue. Survival does not always belong to the strongest figure in the room. Sometimes it belongs to the one who notices what everyone else ignores. Inanna is restored not because forgetting has completed a cosmic rebirth cycle, but because wisdom finds a path through a closed system. The distinction leaves the mystery intact while changing its shape. The underworld can take almost everything. Yet even there, knowledge still matters. 3 days and 3 nights form one of the most memorable intervals in the story, not because the text turned them into a universal law, but because the pause gives the descent measures stillness. Inanna remains in the underworld while the world of the living continues without her. Time passes, but nothing resolves itself naturally. The delay matters because it separates disappearance from recovery and gives the myth a rhythm of suspension. Ancient audiences would have understood that divine absence can disturb the balance between city, temple, fertility, authority, and ritual expectation. You can picture those days moving slowly over southern Mesopotamia. Sunlight rises over canals, workers enter fields, animals drink near muddy banks, and temple courtyards begin their usual routines. Yet somewhere within the religious imagination, a powerful goddess is absent. Her disappearance creates a gap that ordinary activity cannot fill. People continue to breathe, trade, cook, argue, and sleep. While the divine order feels subtly incomplete, the contrast is quiet, which makes it more unsettling. Mainstream historical study has long treated divine disappearance myths as important expressions of instability within ancient religions. Researchers at institutions such as Oxford University and Yale University have examined how stories of absent gods often connect cosmic order with human society. When a deity withdraws or becomes inactive, the consequences can touch fertility, kingship, warfare, weather, or ritual life. The exact function depends on the tradition. But the pattern is widespread across the ancient Near East. Inanna's absence invites comparison with seasonal symbolism because she's connected with sexuality, fertility, and the planet Venus. Older interpretations sometimes treated the story as a straightforward agricultural myth in which descent represented seasonal death and return represented vegetation reborn. That explanation was once popular because it offered an elegant natural cycle. Modern scholarship is more cautious. The narrative contains political, theological, and ritual elements that resist reduction to one agricultural meaning. This open debate matters because the 3-day interval is often pulled into later resurrection system. A modern reader sees a divine figure passing through death for 3 days and naturally thinks of other traditions. Similarities can be interesting, but chronology and cultural context must remain clear. The presence of a 3-day pause does not prove direct connection between distant religions. Numbers often acquire symbolic force independently, especially within stories organised around ritual time. A quirky detail makes the interval even more intriguing. Mesopotamian people paid close attention to celestial cycles, especially the movements of Venus, which was strongly associated with Inanna and later with Ishtar. Venus can disappear from visibility near the sun before reappearing in a different position. Modern interpreters have sometimes connected this astronomical behaviour with myths of descent and return. The comparison is attractive, though scholars disagree over how directly specific literary scenes encode actual planetary observations. You can imagine an ancient skywatcher standing above the flat horizon, waiting for a familiar bright point that has vanished into solar glare. The disappearance would not mean destruction, it would mean temporary invisibility. Eventually the planet returns. Such celestial rhythms may have encouraged symbolic associations between absence and renewed presence, especially for a goddess already linked with Venus. Yet the poem does not pause to offer an astronomical lesson. It remains focused on divine action and consequence. 3 days and 3 nights pass because Inanna has not returned, and her minister's concern becomes urgent. The delay confirms that the original warning was justified. Something has gone wrong enough that outside intervention is necessary. This is where modern rebirth interpretations often become confident. They describe the 3-day suspension as a transitional state between death and reincarnation, as though consciousness requires a fixed interval before memory can be reorganized. Some systems imagine the soul resting in darkness, while old identity dissolves. Others describe a hidden gestation preparing a new form. The ancient text does not support such precision. It does not present 3 days as a universal waiting period for human souls. Inanna is a divine figure involved in an exceptional mythic crisis. The interval belongs to her story, not clearly to every death. Still, the symbolism of waiting carries psychological power. Human transformation rarely feels instantaneous. Loss creates a period when old identity has ended, but new identity has not yet formed. That interval can feel empty, uncertain, and strangely timeless. The 3-day pause can therefore be read as a narrative space between conditions, even without assuming literal reincarnation. For a moment, imagine time when nothing familiar confirms its passage. No clock sounds, no sunlight reaches the chamber, no meal divides morning from evening. The body remains still while the world elsewhere keeps moving. In such a place, 3 days could feel like 3 years or a single breath. The underworld changes not only location but the experience of duration. Ancient societies often mark time through ritual repetition, celestial observation, agricultural labour, and public festivals. A period of 3 days would therefore be felt through repeated absence. One morning passes without return and then another, then another. The repetition builds certainty that ordinary expectations have failed. Scholars continue debating whether such temporal structures in Mesopotamian myths reflect ritual performance schedules, literary design, astronomical symbolism, or combinations of these factors. The surviving evidence rarely allows one explanation to dominate completely. A storyteller can use 3 days because the interval works dramatically, while listeners also hear religious associations unavailable to us now. A fringe theory proposes that the 3-day period represents memory being held in suspension rather than erased. According to this interpretation, the old self exists in a dormant state while consciousness waits between identities. The soul does not yet remember a new life because none has begun, while the previous life is no longer active enough to guide experience. The theory resembles later esoteric ideas more than securely attested Sumerian belief. What the ancient narrative actually gives is simpler and perhaps more powerful. Inanna does not escape because enough time passes. Time alone does nothing. She remains trapped until loyal action, divine wisdom, and carefully planned intervention change the situation. The 3 days therefore prove that restoration is not automatic. This undermines the idea of a mechanical rebirth cycle hidden inside the poem. A true universal system should operate through fixed rules without depending on one particular servant seeking help from one particular god. Instead, the story emphasizes contingency. Rescue happens because relationships still matter. That point changes the meaning of memory. If Inanna's identity were completely erased, loyalty from another person would become strangely irrelevant. Yet Ninshuba remembers her. Enki recognizes her situation. Ereshkigal knows who has entered her domain. The surrounding characters preserve continuity even while Inanna is powerless. Identity therefore survives partly outside the individual. Other beings remember. This is an ancient idea with unusual emotional depth. A person can disappear, but relationships carry traces of that person. A name can continue through ritual. A promise can survive absence. Memory can live in another mind when the original voice is silent. The 3 days become less like a coded timetable for reincarnation and more like a test of whether connection endures when presence disappears. Nothing guarantees return. Nothing happens merely because a cycle demands it. Someone must remember enough to act. Perhaps that's why the interval feels so haunting. It is long enough for uncertainty to become real, yet short enough for hope to remain possible. Time passes in silence. The goddess remains absent. And somewhere above, memory refuses to let absence become final. The price of return appears with the cold logic of a contract. Inanna can rise, but the underworld does not simply surrender what it has claimed. A substitute must eventually take her place. The idea is severe because it turns restoration into exchange rather than mercy. In Mesopotamian thought, boundaries between divine realms could be governed by obligations that even powerful gods respected. The underworld grants no casual exemptions. If one figure leaves, another must satisfy the balance demanded by its law. You can almost feel that balance settling like a weight across the story. Freedom is possible, but not free. Inanna emerges under escort, and agents of the underworld accompany her with a purpose. They are not there to celebrate survival. They are there to ensure that the debt is paid. This changes the emotional meaning of return because every familiar face now carries potential danger. Recognition becomes selection. Loyalty becomes evidence. Grief becomes protection. Mainstream scholarship confirms that substitution plays an important role in several Mesopotamian ritual and mythological traditions. Researchers at institutions such as the University of Chicago and Yale University have examined how exchange of replacement and transferred obligation appear in texts dealing with kingship, divine anger, illness, and ritual danger. The idea is not identical in every case, but the underlying logic is recognizable. A threat can sometimes be redirected if another object, animal, figure, or representative takes its place. The myth dramatizes that logic through personal relationships. Inanna encounters individuals who have mourned her absence, and she does not hand them over. Their grief signals loyalty. The underworld escorts continue searching. This creates a strange moral test because emotional behavior becomes evidence of belonging. Those who suffered during her absence are protected by the fact that they remembered her. A quirky detail makes the scene unexpectedly human. Inanna does not behave like an abstract symbol floating through theology. She evaluates people around her with irritation and loyalty and wounded expectation. The story becomes almost domestic in its emotional sharpness. Divine cosmology suddenly depends on whether someone showed appropriate grief, which proves that even ancient gods could apparently keep track of who failed to look sufficiently upset. The search finally reaches Dumuzi, Inanna's consort. His appearance transforms the problem. Instead of finding him invisibly devastated, Inanna sees a figure whose presentation suggests comfort and status. The exact emotional interpretation remains debated because surviving manuscripts and later versions complicate the scene, but the narrative clearly places him in danger. Inanna identifies him as the one who can be taken. You can imagine the sudden change in atmosphere. Recognition passes across the space, followed by judgment. Dumuzi is no longer simply a husband or divine partner. He becomes the potential replacement demanded by the underworld. Personal relationship collapses into cosmic transaction. This is one of the strongest reasons the descent should not be treated as a simple reincarnation manual. A universal rebirth system would presumably operate through rules applied to every soul. Here, return depends upon someone else entering the place that Inanna leaves. The mechanism is substitution, not automatic renewal. Life above and existence below are connected through exchange. Modern esoteric interpretations sometimes reinterpret the substitute as an old personality sacrificed so a renewed self can emerge. In that symbolic reading, Dumuzi represents the identity that must remain behind when consciousness returns transformed. The theory has poetic force because major change often requires abandoning an earlier version of oneself. Yet the ancient narrative presents Dumuzi as a distinct divine figure, not merely a psychological fragment inside Inanna. The scholarly debate surrounding Dumuzi is particularly rich. Some researchers emphasize his connection with pastoral life and seasonal fertility. Others focus on his role within sacred kingship, lamentation traditions, and divine marriage. His descent into the underworld appears in several compositions, and the relationship between these texts remains complex. There is no single, simple formula explaining every version. Dumuzi's fate also introduces the idea of divided time. Traditions connected with his descent describe arrangements in which his presence below does not remain uninterrupted forever. Another figure can share part of the burden, creating a rhythm of absence and return. This has encouraged seasonal interpretation because alternating presence fits agricultural cycles naturally, yet scholars remain cautious about reducing the entire tradition to vegetation symbolism. For a moment, imagine a pastoral landscape under harsh summer light. Sheep cluster near shade, dust rises beneath hooves, and grass loses its green colour. A god associated with shepherding disappears into the underworld, while lament songs preserve his absence. The emotional structure mirrors environmental change without becoming a simple calendar explanation. Myth can absorb seasonal experience without functioning as a coded weather chart. The substitute requirement also reveals something fundamental about Mesopotamian underworld lore. Escape is exceptional. Death is not treated as a revolving door through which everyone passes repeatedly without consequence. The realm below has a claim, and that claim must be answered. This complicates modern claims about memory erasure before rebirth. If 7 stages existed primarily to prepare souls for another life, the substitute rule becomes difficult to explain. Why would one consciousness need another person to remain dead in order to be reborn? The narrative logic fits negotiated release far better than reincarnation. A fringe theory attempts to solve this by treating substitution symbolically rather than literally. It suggests that every return requires the sacrifice of an old attachment, role, or identity. Something must remain behind because transformation cannot restore the previous self unchanged. In psychological terms, growth has a cost. This interpretation is not ancient doctrine, but it captures an important feature of the myth. Inanna returns, yet the consequences of descent continue. Restoration does not cancel what happened. Relationships change, Dumuzi becomes entangled in the underworld's claim, survival spreads suffering rather than erasing it. That is a much darker idea than simple rebirth. Rebirth often sounds hopeful because something new begins. Substitution introduces debt. One person's return can become another person's descent. The underworld escorts make this principle visible. They move beside Inanna like walking reminders that cosmic law has not forgotten the transaction. Freedom's conditional, the boundary remains active. You sense the difference between transformation and reset. A reset wipes the board clean. Transformation carries consequences forward. Inanna's return belongs to the second category. She does not emerge into innocence, she emerges into obligation. Memory also changes meaning here. Those who mourned are remembered favourably. Those who appeared indifferent become vulnerable. The story therefore treats memory as social and moral, not something merely erased from consciousness. Remembrance affects fate. The substitute rule leaves no comfortable philosophical conclusion. It suggests that returning from darkness may require a cost that cannot be paid with knowledge alone. Someone or something must bear the weight of imbalance. Perhaps ancient listeners heard seasonal truth in that exchange. Perhaps they heard political warning, ritual logic, or family tragedy. It is possible that several meanings operated together. What remains clear is that the underworld does not give without taking, and any theory of rebirth hidden inside this story must reckon with that difficult price. The question of reincarnation becomes unavoidable once the descent is separated from modern spiritual interpretation. Mesopotamian evidence presents a world in which the dead usually continue as dead rather than return automatically through new human bodies. Tombs, family obligations, offerings, mourning rituals, and texts concerning ghosts all point toward continued existence in an underworld realm. This does not mean every belief was identical across every city or century, but the broad pattern is remarkably consistent. Death changes location and condition. It does not normally begin a documented cycle of repeated earthly birth. You can imagine a household at dusk preparing food and drink for deceased relatives. The gestures are practical, almost intimate. Water is poured, names are remembered. Family lines matter, because the living maintain relationships with those who have entered the realm below. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian burials confirms that communities treated the dead as socially significant long after physical life ended. Researchers at institutions such as the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Chicago have studied burial customs showing how households preserved connection through ritual care. The dead remained part of family memory. This continued relationship creates a major problem for claims that Sumerians taught systematic memory erasure before immediate rebirth. If the dead were expected to reappear quickly in new bodies, long-term offerings to identifiable ancestors would make less sense. Instead, surviving tradition suggests that ghosts could remain associated with family, burial place, and underworld identity. A deceased person might need sustenance, proper ritual attention, and remembrance from descendants. One strange feature of Mesopotamian belief is that neglect could make the dead troublesome. A ghost deprived of proper burial or offerings might become restless and afflict the living. Illness, disturbing dreams, or misfortune could sometimes be interpreted through this relationship. The dead were not merely gone, they could remain present enough to demand attention. That idea is very different from a system in which memory is wiped clean, so consciousness can begin another earthly life. A ghost who remembers family and seeks offerings still possesses continuity. Identity persists through name, relationship, and expectation. Forgetting would weaken the very logic that makes ancestor ritual meaningful. Mainstream historical evidence therefore supports underworld continuity far more strongly than reincarnation. Mesopotamian texts describe the realm of the dead as dusty, dim, and difficult, often lacking the pleasures associated with life above. The dead continue there under conditions shaped by burial, status, and ritual care. The picture is not entirely uniform, but repeated earthly rebirth does not occupy the central position found in some later religious traditions. You can feel the difference in atmosphere. Reincarnation implies movement forward into another beginning. Mesopotamian death often feels like settling into a shadowed continuation. The dead retain enough identity to remain themselves while losing the fullness of earthly existence. They are diminished, not necessarily erased. An open scholarly debate concerns how literally these descriptions should be treated. Some texts are literary, others ritual, and others connected with mourning or magical practice. Scholars at Oxford University and Yale University have examined how underworld imagery changes across genres. A poetic description of dust and darkness may not represent a formal theological doctrine, yet taken together, the evidence still favours continued existence below rather than repeated incarnation above. A quirky detail appears in the treatment of names. Preserving a person's name could help maintain social existence after death. Inscriptions, family memory, and ritual mention gave continuity to identity. To be forgotten was a deeper kind of disappearance. This suggests that memory itself functioned almost opposite to the modern seven erasure theory. Remembrance sustained the dead. For a moment, imagine your name spoken decades after your death by someone who never met you. The voice carries information across generations. A family member pours water and repeats the name because memory has become a form of connection. In that setting, forgetting is not purification, forgetting is loss. This does not mean Mesopotamians never imagined transformation after death. Divine myths contain extraordinary returns, rescues, substitutions, and journeys between realms. Gods can cross boundaries unavailable to ordinary humans. Heroes can seek immortality. Spirits can appear in dreams. Mythic exceptions exist everywhere. The danger comes from turning exception into universal rule. Inanna's journey concerns a goddess whose divine status allows events far beyond ordinary funerary expectation. Her restoration does not prove that every deceased human passes through 7 gates, loses 7 memory layers, and enters another body. The surviving tradition never presents such a general law. Fringe interpretations sometimes point towards similarities with later beliefs in reincarnation, and argue that Mesopotamia preserved an earlier version of the same idea. Similarity alone, however, cannot establish transmission. Cultures often develop parallel metaphors involving descent, darkness, stripping, judgment, and return because these images arise naturally from human experiences of loss and transformation. The historical timeline also matters. Sumerian religious traditions developed over long periods, interacting with Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cultures. Ideas changed, merged, and acquired new meanings. A concept appearing clearly in a much later tradition should not automatically be projected backward onto an earlier Sumerian text without evidence. This is where the phrase memory erasure becomes especially misleading. Mesopotamian texts certainly care about memory. Kings want their names remembered. Families remember ancestors. Scribes copy old compositions. Temples preserve ritual traditions. Memory is a source of continuity and legitimacy. Erasure, by contrast, is often feared. A destroyed name can threaten posthumous reputation. A forgotten lineage loses social presence. A neglected ghost becomes dangerous. The cultural value placed on remembrance does not fit comfortably with the idea that salvation requires systematic forgetting. That does not eliminate symbolic interpretations of what Inanna's stripping. The 7 removals can still be read as loss of social identity, protection, authority, or attachment. What changes is the claim about what happens to ordinary people after death. Historical evidence supports a much darker continuity than modern rebirth systems often promise. You can imagine a dead ancestor sitting somewhere beyond ordinary sight, not preparing to become someone else, but remaining connected to the family who still speaks the name. The underworld is not a waiting room for a new body. It is a destination with its own relationships and obligations. A fringe theory occasionally suggests that reincarnation beliefs were secret knowledge restricted to priests and therefore absent from surviving texts. This possibility cannot be disproved completely because lost traditions are always possible. Yet historical method cannot build certainty from absence. A claim becomes stronger when evidence survives, not when missing evidence is treated as proof of secrecy. The scholarly position remains cautious. There is no convincing body of Sumerian evidence demonstrating a systematic doctrine of human reincarnation, governed by 7 stages of memory erasure. The descent of Inanna offers transformation, return, and symbolic stripping, but not a clearly stated cycle of repeated human lives. Perhaps the hidden truth is therefore less comforting than the modern theory. The ancient dead may not have been expected to forget and begin again. They may have been expected to remain themselves in a diminished world, dependent upon the living to keep memory from fading. And if remembrance was the bridge between worlds, then forgetting was not the path to rebirth. It was the beginning of a second death. The idea of 7 stages of memory erasure appears most clearly when modern spiritual interpretation begins arranging ancient symbols into a psychological system. The original poem provides 7 gates: repeated removal, divine judgment, and eventual restoration. Those ingredients are powerful enough to invite reconstruction. Later readers begin asking whether each external loss might represent an internal loss as well. From there, a new sequence emerges: status, perception, personal power, desire, identity, autobiographical continuity, and final self-recognition. It feels ancient because the framework is built around genuinely ancient imagery. But the detailed memory model belongs to a much later interpretive world. You can almost see how easily the transformation happens. A modern writer places the 7 gates in a list, assigns one mental function to each, and then explains the descent as a map of consciousness. The pattern looks clean, the order feels intentional, psychological labels seem to fit the removals well enough that the structure begins to acquire its own authority. Readers encounter the system without seeing where interpretation ends and translation begins. Mainstream historical method treats this distinction very carefully. Researchers at institutions such as Oxford University, Yale University, and the University of Chicago routinely separate what a text explicitly states from what later readers infer. This is especially important in ancient religion because symbols are flexible. A crown can represent authority, a garment can represent status or protection, a gate can represent transition. None of those meanings automatically creates a doctrine of reincarnation. The modern memory sequence likely developed because symbolic psychology prefers ordered systems. Human beings are drawn to numbered frameworks because they make difficult ideas easier to remember. 7 stages feel complete. They can be taught, illustrated, repeated, and connected with other 7-fold systems from unrelated traditions. Once that happens, the structure can begin circulating independently from the ancient source that inspired it. A quirky feature of modern esoteric writing is how frequently distant traditions become linked through shared numbers. 7 gates may be compared with 7 planetary spheres, 7 levels of consciousness, 7 sacred centers, 7 heavens, or 7 stages of initiation. The comparison can be imaginative and meaningful, but shared numbering does not prove historical connection. Numbers travel easily through human imagination because they provide memorable structure even when cultures never exchange the same doctrine. This is where the exact order of memory erasure becomes particularly revealing. The ancient poem does not provide psychological labels beside each gate. The labels must therefore be assigned by an interpreter. One writer might place status first and perception second, another might arrange emotion before identity, a third might include moral memory, family memory, or bodily memory. The absence of a standardized ancient list means the modern sequence can pod Verisal still claiming Sumerian inspiration. For a moment, imagine a damaged tablet displayed under museum light. The signs are ancient, difficult, and incomplete. Beside it sits a modern diagram containing 7 perfect circles connected by arrows. The tablet is messy because history is messy. The diagram is clean because interpretation prefers order. Viewers often trust the diagram because it looks more complete than the evidence. That contrast explains much of the mystery. Ancient texts survive through fragments, variant readings, and uncertain terminology. Modern systems often remove uncertainty by filling gaps with symbolic meaning. The result can become more satisfying than the source because it answers questions the source never intended to answer. The open scholarly debate concerns how far symbolic interpretation can responsibly go. Some historians are comfortable exploring psychological or ritual meanings as long as they remain clearly speculative. Others prefer stronger limits, especially when modern concepts are projected onto ancient vocabulary. The disagreement is not about whether myths can carry deep symbolism. It is about how confidently modern readers can claim to recover meanings never stated directly. The phrase memory erasure itself illustrates the problem. Ancient Mesopotamian literature certainly contains forgetting, remembrance, naming, reputation, and continuity. Yet the language of systematic memory deletion belongs to a modern conceptual framework. It sounds almost technical, as though the poem describes a precise procedure carried out upon consciousness. The surviving evidence does not support that level of specificity. A fringe interpretation sometimes proposes that ancient priests deliberately concealed the psychological meaning beneath ritual imagery. In this view, the 7 removed objects are coded symbols understood only by initiates. The absence of explicit explanation is then treated as evidence of secrecy. This argument can become impossible to test because any missing evidence is interpreted as proof that the teaching was hidden. Historical reasoning works differently. A secret tradition is possible, but possibility is not confirmation. Scholars look for related texts, ritual instructions, parallel vocabulary, repeated symbols, and archaeological context. Without those supports, hidden doctrine remains speculation. Mystery should not become permission to invent certainty. Still, the modern reconstruction reveals something genuine about human storytelling. People naturally turn journeys into inner journeys. A gate becomes a threshold of consciousness. Clothing becomes identity. Darkness becomes unconscious experience. Return becomes rebirth. The symbols are flexible enough to support these readings, even when the ancient authors may have intended something else. You can hear how compelling the sequence sounds when spoken slowly. First, status fades, then perception weakens, personal power becomes uncertain, desire loosens, identity becomes unstable, memory fragments. Finally, the sense of self dissolves. As a modern psychological narrative, the structure is elegant. It describes transformation through progressive reduction. The problem appears only when elegance is mistaken for historical proof. This distinction does not make the modern interpretation worthless. Symbolic readings can help listeners reflect on identity, mortality, attachment, and change. A story can acquire new meaning across centuries without betraying its original form. The danger begins when later meaning is presented as literal ancient teaching. A council decree carved in clay would be strong evidence. A ritual tablet listing 7 memory stages would be stronger still. A funerary text describing rebirth through 7 psychological erasures would transform the debate completely. No such securely attested Sumerian document currently anchors the claim. Instead, what survives is a myth whose structure is open enough to invite later system. That openness may explain why the idea spreads so easily. The ancient story provides authority. The modern framework provides explanation. Combined together, they create something that feels both mysterious and organized. For a moment, the distinction between ancient and modern becomes almost invisible. A listener hears the 7 gates and assumes the 7 psychological meanings were written beside them. Repetition turns interpretation into familiarity. Familiarity slowly begins to feel like evidence. This is how hidden traditions can be created without deliberate deception. One writer speculates, another repeats the speculation, a third removes the cautious language. Eventually, possibility becomes claim, and claim becomes alleged ancient fact. The exact order of memory erasure therefore tells you as much about modern minds as ancient ones. We want death to have structure. We want identity to have layers. We want rebirth to follow a sequence that can be understood. The 7 gates provide a perfect scaffold for that desire. Perhaps that is why the theory survives. Not because the clay spells it out, but because the human mind dislikes an empty space, especially when 7 ancient doors seem to be waiting for something meaningful to place behind them. The ancient text and the modern reconstruction now sit beside one another like 2 objects under the same museum light. One is irregular, incomplete, and rooted in a world of temples, scribes, divine law, and underworld politics. The other is clean, psychological, and arranged into 7 precise stages that explain what happens to memory before rebirth. Both can be meaningful, but they are not the same thing. The challenge is learning to admire the second without quietly pretending it was carved into the first. You can imagine a scholar working through a difficult line of Sumerian, comparing several copies while signs blur at broken edges. The process is slow because every translation decision matters. A word can carry several shades of meaning. An object may have no exact equivalent in modern English. A damaged line may survive more clearly in one manuscript than another. This is why ancient literature often reaches you through cautious reconstruction rather than perfect certainty. Mainstream historical research depends upon that caution. Scholars at institutions such as the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Chicago, Yale University, and Oxford University regularly compare grammar, manuscript variation, archaeological context, and parallel texts before assigning meaning. The goal is not to remove mystery, it is to prevent modern expectation from being mistaken for ancient evidence. That discipline can feel less exciting than secret interpretation, but it is what allows genuine discoveries to remain distinguishable from attractive invention. The 7-gate sequence survives strongly enough to be treated as an authentic feature of the story. Inanna passes through 7 thresholds, and items of her regalia are removed. The poem also contains judgment, death-like suspension, rescue, restoration, and substitution. These elements do not need embellishment to remain strange. The ancient narrative already possesses a carefully ordered structure that raises serious questions about power, mortality, divine jurisdiction, and identity. What does not survive is a tablet explaining 7 categories of memory erased in preparation for reincarnation. There is no securely translated line identifying a first memory layer, a second mental layer, or a final erased self. There is no ancient diagram assigning psychological functions to each object. That absence does not prove ancient audiences saw no symbolic meaning. It simply means the exact modern system cannot honestly be presented as direct translation. A quirky feature of historical interpretation is how easily certainty grows during repetition. The first writer says an object may symbolize identity. The second writer says it symbolizes identity. The third says ancient priests knew it represented identity. By the time the claim reaches an audience, the original uncertainty has disappeared completely. History has not changed. The wording has. You can almost hear the process happening in slow motion. Perhaps becomes probably becomes certainly, you see, symbol becomes doctrine, literary sequence becomes ritual technology, a goddess becomes every human soul, restoration becomes reincarnation, 7 removed objects become 7 erased memories. Each step is small enough to feel harmless, yet the final claim stands far from where the ancient evidence began. The scholarly debate is not about whether modern people are allowed to interpret ancient myths creatively. Myth has always been reinterpreted. The debate concerns labelling. A symbolic reading should remain a symbolic reading. A historical claim should require historical support. Problems arise when a modern spiritual framework is presented as something archaeologists have secretly discovered or academics refuse to acknowledge. There is no need for conspiracy to explain the gap. Ancient texts are difficult. Academic translations can be cautious and technical. Modern retellings prefer smooth narratives. Social media rewards certainty far more than ambiguity. A statement claiming that one ancient tablet reveals the exact 7 stages of forgotten memory travels more easily than a statement explaining that several manuscript witnesses preserve a 7-fold stripping whose exact symbolic meaning remains debate. The second version is less dramatic. It is also closer to the evidence. Yet something valuable survives inside the modern interpretation. The 7 stages provide a psychological lens through which people can think about how identity is assembled. Status, perception, agency, attachment, personality, memory, and self-recognition are genuine parts of human experience. A myth about progressive stripping naturally encourages reflection upon them. The mistake would be assuming that because the interpretation feels psychologically insightful, it must therefore be historically ancient. For a moment, imagine the clay surface again, Mustaine. It does not protest when modern meanings are placed upon it. Ancient objects are yint, which makes them unusually patient companions for human projection. A crown can become ego, a garment can become personality, a gate can become a level of consciousness. The symbols accept everything because symbols cannot correct us. Archaeology can, context can, language can. Those restraints are not in a maze of imagination. They protect the difference between discovery and invention. A fringe theory sometimes argues that academic historians deliberately suppress esoteric readings because such ideas threaten conventional history. This claim appears frequently around ancient civilizations, especially when texts involve gods, celestial imagery, hidden knowledge, or unusual numerical structures. Yet disagreement from specialists usually has a simpler cause. Extraordinary interpretations require strong evidence, and evidence must survive comparison with language, dating, archaeology, and related texts. The possibility of lost traditions remains real. Entire libraries have vanished. Tablets crumble. Sites remain unexcavated. Wars, looting, erosion, and rebuilding destroy context. No historian can claim that every ancient idea is already known. It is entirely possible that future excavations will change interpretations of Mesopotamian religion. Possibility, however, cannot be treated as recovered fact. That principle matters because genuine surprises happen in archaeology. New tablets can reveal unknown rulers, neglected rituals, unexpected trade connections, and forgotten literary compositions. When discoveries occur, they are powerful precisely because the scholars can show where the objects came from, how they are dated, what the signs say, and how the reading compares with existing evidence. A supposed hidden doctrine without those anchors remains something else. It may be philosophy, it may be spiritual symbolism, it may be creative reconstruction, it may even become personally meaningful. What it cannot yet become is established Sumerian teaching. This distinction does not reduce the mystery of the 7 gates. In some ways, it deepens it. The ancient sequence remains partly unexplained. Scholars can identify broad themes of authority, vulnerability, divine law, and descent, but not every symbolic association can be recovered with confidence. The unknown portion is real. That kind of uncertainty is quieter than conspiracy, but more honest. You are not told that a secret answer has been hidden from you. You are left with fragments whose meanings cannot be restored completely. The silence belongs to history itself. Perhaps this is why the story continues to attract reinterpretation. A fully explained myth would leave less room for imagination. Inanna's descent survives with enough structure to feel intentional and enough ambiguity to remain open. Every generation can walk toward the gates carrying its own questions. Modern readers bring psychology. Earlier interpreters brought ritual, astronomy, fertility, kingship, and seasonal symbolism. Scholars bring philology and archaeological context. Spiritual writers bring theories of consciousness and rebirth. None of these approaches disappear simply because another exists, but they should not be blended carelessly. The hidden system then may not be one ancient code waiting to be solved. It may be the recurring human habit of constructing systems whenever fragments refuse to explain themselves. You see 7 gates and want 7 meanings. You see 7 losses and want 7 layers. You see return from death and want rebirth. The pattern is consulting because the human mind is a builder of patterns. And perhaps the most unsettling discovery is not that the tablet concealed a secret doctrine, but that we are still capable of placing one there. The 7th gate remains powerful precisely because it refuses to become one final answer. You can stand at the edge of the surviving story and see several possibilities at once. One interpretation treats the descent as a drama of divine authority, where a powerful goddess enters another ruler's domain and loses the symbols that make her sovereign elsewhere. Another sees ritual humiliation, followed by restoration through wisdom and carefully negotiated release. A modern symbolic reading sees the 7 losses as stages through which identity becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Each approach reveals something different, yet none can honestly transform the surviving poem into a confirmed manual for memory erasure before incarnation. Your mind drifts toward the ancient cities where these stories once lived, among temples, workshops, fields, and crowded streets. The people who heard them did not experience Mesopotamian religion as a collection of museum exhibits. The gods belonged to weather, harvest, political authority, sickness, desire, family, dreams, and death. Stories were woven into ordinary uncertainty, a failed crop, a dangerous birth, a military defeat, or an unexpected illness could raise questions about divine intention. Myths offered structure without always offering comfort. Mainstream historical evidence gives you several firm points. Mesopotamian funerary traditions usually imagine the dead continuing within an underworld, rather than entering an automatic sequence of earthly rebirths. Inanna's descent describes a unique divine journey containing 7 gates and progressive stripping. Her restoration preserves her identity, rather than replacing it with a new human form. Research from universities such as Yale University, Oxford University, the University of Chicago, and the University of Pennsylvania has helped establish this broader religious context through textual and archaeological study. That evidence does not explain every symbol, it simply limits what can responsibly be claimed. The mystery therefore changes shape. Instead of asking whether the Sumerians secretly documented an exact reincarnation procedure, you begin asking why a sevenfold dismantling feels so psychologically convincing to modern readers. Perhaps the answer lies within the structure of human identity itself. People experience the self in layers. Whether or not ancient scribes describe those layers explicitly, you carry social roles, preferences, relationships, memories, ambitions, bodily habits, and private stories. Remove them gradually, and the question of what remains becomes unavoidable. A quirky comparison can be found in the way ancient seals preserved identity. A small cylinder rolled across wet clay could leave an image representing ownership, office, or authority. The physical seal might later disappear, but its impression remained. Human memory works differently, yet the metaphor is tempting. A life leaves impressions in other people, built-in objects, documents, and family stories. Even when the person is absent, traces persist. Perhaps this is why complete memory erasure remains such an unsettling idea. If every trace disappeared, continuity would vanish with it. Rebirth might become indistinguishable from the creation of an entirely different person, without remembered experiences or preserved personality, or some deeper connection. What exactly crosses from one life into another? Philosophy has struggled with versions of this problem for centuries, and the Sumerian descent does not solve it for us. An open scholarly debate continues around how ancient audiences understood the symbolism of the 7 removals. Some scholars emphasize political authority and divine regalia. Others explore ritual transformation or literary structure. There is also continuing discussion about celestial associations, sacred numbers, and the relationship between different Mesopotamian traditions concerning Inanna and her later Akkadian counterpart. These debates remain productive because the evidence supports questions more strongly than final answers. A fringe possibility still lingers. Perhaps some listeners in antiquity heard the 7 gates as an inward journey without leaving written explanations behind. Oral interpretation, ritual performance, and local teaching can disappear even when literary texts survive. Historians cannot prove that such private readings never existed, yet they also cannot treat invisible traditions as established facts. That boundary between possibility and evidence is where the oldest stories often become most interesting. Certainty would close the door. Uncertainty keeps it slightly open. You can imagine returning to the first surface of clay where a scribe once pressed signs with a reed. The room is quiet except for movement outside. Someone carries grain through a courtyard. A child calls from another doorway. Reed mats shift in warm air. The scribe continues copying a story whose future cannot be imagined. Thousands of years later, people still read those signs and searched for meanings that may have changed many times. Some look for theology, some look for psychology, some look for hidden technology, forgotten astronomy, or evidence of reincarnation. Every generation approaches the clay carrying different expectations. The ancient text survives all of them. That may be its greatest strength. It refuses to become exhausted by one interpretation. It remains a story about descent, loss, judgment, helplessness, rescue, and consequence. Those themes are broad enough to speak across cultures without needing to become a coded doctrine. The 7 gates can therefore be held in 2 ways at once. Historically, they belong to a Mesopotamian myth governed by divine law and underworld politics. Symbolically, They can become a meditation on what happens when the layers supporting identity are removed one by one. The second reading does not need to pretend it was written explicitly into the ancient clay. For a moment, consider the final question raised by the modern memory theory. If the self can lose status, protection, agency, desire, personality, autobiographical continuity, and self-recognition, what remains beneath all 7 losses? A soul, perhaps, pure awareness, perhaps nothing at all, perhaps the Sumerian poem does not tell you. That silence is important. Ancient stories often survive because they leave enough space for listeners to enter them. A complete philosophical system might become outdated. A powerful image can remain alive for millennia. 7 gates are such an image. They invite counting. They invite interpretation. They fear because every gate removes something familiar. Yet the deepest historical truth may be simpler than any hidden doctrine. The Sumerian text does not clearly describe 7 stages of memory erasure before rebirth. It describes a goddess whose identity is progressively stripped as she enters the underworld, followed by judgment, restoration, and a costly return. Everything beyond that belongs to interpretation. And interpretation is not failure. It is one of the ways ancient stories continue breathing. As the last imagined gate fades into darkness, you do not need to decide whether it represents memory, authority, ritual, death, or something forgotten by history. You can allow the possibilities to remain beside one another. The clay survives, the questions survive, and perhaps the story is not yet complete. The room around you can grow quieter now. The gates no longer need to open, and nothing more needs to be surrendered. Let the underworld recede into the distance, leaving only the faint impression of clay, cold stone, and a sky filled with ancient stars. You can return slowly to the ordinary sounds around you. A distant vehicle passes, air moves through a room. Somewhere, someone else is still awake beneath another part of the night. The ancient cities are gone, yet their stories remain close enough to enter whenever the mind grows quiet. Perhaps that is memory in its gentlest form, not perfect preservation, but enough surviving fragments to make presence possible again. A name spoken, a tablet read, a story carried from one generation into another. You do not need a final answer tonight. The 7 gates can stay closed within imagination, their meanings resting quietly behind them. Perhaps they mark power. Perhaps they marked transformation. Perhaps later generations place their own fears affecting upon them. All of those possibilities can remain unresolved. Let the dust settle across the old roads. Let the temple lamps fade. Let the last reed stylus rest beside a finished tablet while darkness gathers beyond the doorway. Nothing is asking you to solve the mystery now. The ancient world can remain where it is, distant and unfinished. And perhaps somewhere between memory and silence, the story continues without needing to explain itself. Good night.